At 45, Arthur Vance was completely broken. His logistics company had gone under, his savings were wiped clean, and his wife had just walked out the door with the keys to their suburban home. He had exactly $40 left in his pocket, no job prospects, and nowhere to go. With his back against the wall, he packed his remaining clothes into a single duffel bag and drove up to Blackwood Ridge to claim the only asset left to his name, a derelict, freezing, manual weather station built in 1934 that he had inherited from an estranged grandfather. When his ultra-wealthy uncle found out, he laughed straight to Arthur's face. "The world is automated by satellites now, Arthur," he sneered. "You're moving into a worthless pile of rocks to count raindrops." But 3 weeks later, while clearing dry rot from the station's deep stone cellar, Arthur pried open a heavy military-grade steel cabinet that had been padlocked for 40 years. Inside, he didn't find weather logs. He found a massive collection of hand-drawn topographic maps marked with unsettling crimson boundary lines and a hidden note that read, "The truth cannot be automated." He unrolled the map from 1994, stared at the valley below, and realized that everything the town believed about their land was a lie. Before we look inside that locked cabinet and uncover the mystery that changed Arthur's life forever, where are you listening to this story right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? Drop your location and time in the comments below. I love seeing how far our community reaches, wherever you are. I truly hope you are having a wonderful and blessed day ahead. We work incredibly hard to bring these historical mysteries to life. So if you spot any details we can improve, please leave your honest feedback in the comments. And if you want to find out what Arthur discovered on those maps, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Now, let's return to the wind-swept ridge and see what was hidden in the dark. The rusted-out tailpipe of Arthur Vance's 2008 Ford Escape gave a rhythmic, metallic cough as the vehicle struggled up the final gravel switchback of Blackwood Ridge. The odometer had rolled past 240,000 miles somewhere near the Oregon border, and now, miles deep into the damp, salt-shrouded wilderness of coastal Maine, the engine sounded like it was chewing on its own valves. Inside the cabin, the heater only blew a tepid, damp air that smelled faintly of antifreeze and old pennies. Arthur gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white and skin chapped from the biting mid-October wind that swept off the Atlantic. He was 45 years old, and everything he had built over 2 decades of meticulous corporate logistics management had been reduced to what could fit into 3 faded duffel bags rolling around in the back seat. His company, Vance Global Logistics, had spent 15 years optimizing supply chains across the Pacific Northwest. But a sudden, catastrophic shift in shipping contracts, combined with a disastrous supply chain freeze, had collapsed the business in less than 90 days. The bankruptcy lawyers had been efficient, stripping away his commercial properties, his investments, and finally, the 4-bedroom craftsman home in Portland where he had watched his daughter grow up. The divorce that followed hadn't been angry, it had been hollow. A quiet acknowledgement between 2 people who realized their bond had been anchored entirely to a stability that no longer existed. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own face, hollowed gray eyes, dark circles that seemed permanently bruised into his skin, and a hairline that had surrendered to silver along the temples. He reached into his pocket and touched his remaining cash, 2 $20 bills, crisp and cold, a pathetic mockery of a man who used to oversee 7-figure quarterly distributions. The tires slipped on a patch of wet pine needles, the transmission whining in protest as the incline grew steeper. pushing him further away from the civilized world and deeper into the unforgiving, gray-green canopy of the North Atlantic woods. The property ahead was his absolute last resort, a bizarre legal anomaly that had slipped through the fingers of his creditors because its assessed value was practically zero. It was a decommissioned manual weather station built in 1934 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, passed down through a grandfather he had only met twice in his infancy. Harlan Vance had been a ghost in the family lineage, a man who had chosen complete isolation on this high, wind-battered ridge, cutting off ties with the rest of the world until his quiet death 6 months prior. Arthur pulled over to the side of the road for a brief moment, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his vibrating phone from the dashboard. The screen displayed his ex-wife's name, Helen. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice before pressing the accept button. "Helen, hey," he said, his voice sounding raspy even to his own ears. There was a long pause on the other end, filled only by the crackle of poor cellular reception and the distant hum of a Portland highway. "Arthur, are you actually there yet?" she asked, her tone a mix of exhaustion and faint pity that made his chest tighten. "The lawyers called again about the remaining corporate tax liens. They need your signature on the final asset forfeiture disclosure." Arthur stared through the cracked windshield at the dark silhouettes of the pines. "I'm almost at the ridge. Helen, I'll sign the digital documents as soon as I can find a stable internet connection up here. How is Clara?" Another heavy silence stretched between them. "Clara is 21, Arthur. She's working 2 shifts at the university library just to cover the tuition deficit since the college fund collapsed. She tries to hide it, but she's angry. She doesn't understand how a man who spent his entire life calculating risks could let everything vanish overnight." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow to the sternum, knocking the breath from his lungs. "I didn't plan for the carrier network to collapse. Helen, I didn't plan for any of this." "Nobody does, Arthur," she said quietly. "But you're the one who was supposed to be looking at the numbers. Just find a place to settle. Stop running." The call clicked off before he could answer, the signal dying completely as the signal bars on his phone dropped to a single, hollow circle. He set the phone back down, feeling an overwhelming wave of grief wash over him. He wasn't just broke. He was redundant. The modern, automated world had no use for a human logistics expert whose algorithms had been outpaced by software. And his family had no use for a provider who could no longer provide. He shifted the Ford back into drive, forcing his focus onto the road as the trees broke apart to reveal the summit of Blackwood Ridge. The weather station appeared through the swirling coastal fog like a stone monolith. The main structure was built from heavy split field stone and weathered cedar shingles that had turned a ghostly iridescent silver from decades of salt spray and relentless moisture. A towering 40-foot iron anemometer structure stood adjacent to the cottage, its rusted metal lattice groaning in the gale, the copper cups at the top spinning with a frantic, chaotic velocity. The windows of the stone house were dark, and several of the upper panes were boarded up with rotting plywood. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb, a monument to a bygone era when men had to stand in the cold to measure the sky instead of relying on automated satellite arrays. Arthur killed the engine, and the sudden absence of the car's mechanical hum allowed the full force of the Atlantic wind to slam against the chassis. He stepped out onto the muddy gravel, his boots sinking into the saturated earth, and walked toward the heavy oak front door. The brass key he had received from the probate executor was heavy, tarnished with verdigris, and it fought him as he jammed it into the rusted keyway. With a harsh, scraping twist, the deadbolt finally threw back, and the door creaked open, releasing a draft of air that smelled intensely of old wool, dried lavender, wood smoke, and damp masonry. The interior was frozen in time. A massive stone hearth dominated the living area, filled with the cold gray ash of a fire that had died months ago. A simple wool blanket was draped over a sagging armchair, and a physical desk sat in the corner, covered in blank ledger books and dried-up inkwells. This was where his grandfather had lived out his final decades, entirely detached from the digital revolution, manually logging the wind, the rain, and the atmospheric pressure every single hour. Arthur dropped his duffel bags onto the dusty floorboards and walked toward the large bay window that overlooked the eastern slope of the ridge. As he approached, a sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the frame, and with a sharp crack, one of the lower glass panes shattered inward, showering the hardwood floor with razor-sharp fragments. The freezing storm air immediately rushed into the room, threatening to drop the internal temperature to near freezing within minutes. Arthur cursed under his breath, his logistics training instantly switching on to handle the immediate crisis. He couldn't survive the night with an open breach in the living quarters. He searched the kitchen drawers until he found a pair of heavy canvas work gloves and an old, rusted hammer. He marched out to the dilapidated woodshed behind the house, his face stinging from the rain that had begun to fall in earnest. He dragged a sheet of salvageable plywood from the debris, his muscles aching from the unaccustomed manual labor. Back inside the house, he knelt in the shattered glass, his hands shaking with cold as he began to nail the plywood over the broken frame. The physical exertion was a strange comfort, a distraction from the mental rot that had consumed him for months. But as he drove the third nail into the cedar trim, the hammer slipped, striking his thumb. He dropped the tool, sinking back onto his heels, cradling his throbbing hand against his chest as the sheer absurdity of his situation hit him. He was a man who used to coordinate international freight lanes, and now he was bleeding in a derelict shack on the edge of the continent. He forced himself to finish the job, his breath pluming in the darkening room as he secured the final corner of the wood barrier. The wind howled against the makeshift patch, but the draft subsided as he began to sweep up the broken glass with a stiff brush he found by the hearth. His broom struck something metallic hidden beneath the dust bunnies under the heavy oak desk. He reached down and pulled out a heavy, circular instrument made of solid brass. It was a manual marine barometer, heavily tarnished but structurally intact. Arthur wiped the thick layer of grime from the glass face, expecting to see standard meteorological markings, millibars, inches of mercury, or simple designations for rain, change, and fair. Instead, the dial was hand-annotated with fine, precise ink lettering that had faded to a deep sepia. The instrument had been modified. Around the outer rim of the dial, instead of pressure numbers, there were a series of hand-stamped letters and numbers. BWR-1982-SYS-04. Below the needle, which was currently pointing rigidly toward a dangerously low-pressure zone, his grandfather had engraved a single sentence directly into the brass backing. The sky remembers what the dirt tries to hide. Arthur frowned, turning the heavy instrument over in his hands. There were no digital components, no wireless transmitters, just an intricate system of tiny levers and an aneroid capsule that reacted to the weight of the atmosphere. Yet, the serial number stamped into the rim matched the precise formatting of the old shipping manifests Arthur used to manage for historical archival transport. Why would a remote weather station barometer carry a corporate or institutional logistics designation from 1982. He placed the barometer on the desk. The mystery scratching at the edges of his analytical mind, he looked around the room, noticing for the first time that the walls weren't just decorated with standard maps. They were covered in detailed charts of local water tables, geological fault lines, and historical property boundaries that seemed to have nothing to do with meteorology. He sat down in his grandfather's old armchair, wrapping the dusty wool blanket tightly around his shoulders as the darkness outside became total. The storm was fully unleashed now, rain lashing against the stone exterior like handfuls of gravel. He closed his eyes, his mind spinning with the financial ruin he had left behind, the shattered relationship with his daughter, and the cryptic engraving on the brass barometer. He was completely alone, miles away from anyone who cared whether he lived or died, trapped in a stone cage on top of a mountain. Just as his exhaustion began to pull him under into a fitful sleep, a sound vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the rhythmic shuddering of the wind against the roof, nor was it the creaking of the old cedar rafters. It was a heavy, rhythmic, metallic thud, thud, thud that seemed to originate from deep beneath the stone foundation of the house, directly under the instrument room. The vibration was clear, deliberate, and entirely mechanical, echoing through the dark, empty structure like the slow, steady heartbeat of a long-buried machine. Arthur sat bolt upright, his breath catching in his throat as the floorboards beneath his boots trembled once more. The rhythmic, metallic thud beneath the floorboards continued to shake the fieldstone foundation of Blackwood Ridge, vibrating up through the legs of the heavy oak desk and into the marrow of Arthur Vance's bones. He stood frozen in the center of the dark instrument room, his heart hammering against his ribs as the old structure groaned under the dual assault of the Atlantic gale and the subterranean shudder. He knew he had to act. As an experienced logistics manager who had spent 25 years diagnosing systemic failures in sprawling automated distribution warehouses, he understood that an unaddressed mechanical anomaly, left to rattle under high structural load, would inevitably rip itself apart. Grabbing the industrial steel flashlight he had salvaged from his car's glove box, Arthur swept the beam across the floorboards until he located a recessed brass ring pull near the pantry wall, the access hatch to the crawlspace and cellar below. He tugged the heavy timber door upward, and a blast of air that was even colder and more intensely saturated with the odor of damp earth, rusted iron, and stale water rushed up to meet him. Descending the steep, narrow wooden steps, the flashlight beam sliced through a thick curtain of cobwebs, illuminating water droplets weeping from the rough-hewn granite foundation blocks. The sound grew deafening down here, a hollow mechanical clanging that echoed off the stone walls. But as Arthur stepped onto the packed dirt floor, his initial panic subsided into analytical curiosity as the light revealed the source. It wasn't an engine or a secret machine, but a massive archaic stabilization apparatus. A heavy iron pendulum, over 4 feet long and counterweighted with solid lead discs, was suspended from a structural oak timber directly linked by thick steel cables to the base of the external anemometer mast outside. The storm's high-velocity gusts were violently twisting the wind tower on the roof, causing the cables to yank the massive safety pendulum past its normal dampening arc, slamming it repeatedly into a heavy iron anchor plate bolted to the foundation wall. Arthur saw that the primary leather guide strap meant to restrict the pendulum's lateral swing had rotted away, snapped by decades of moisture and neglect. To stop the structural damage to his new sanctuary, he had to solve this immediate practical challenge before the next massive squall hit the ridge. He looked around the damp cellar, his boots splashing through shallow pools of water, until he spotted a coil of thick, oiled hemp utility rope resting on an old wooden crate near the coal bin. Working with a frantic efficiency, Arthur timed the violent swings of the iron mass, stepping into the damp shadows and throwing a secure loop of the heavy rope around the copper neck of the pendulum just as it rebounded off the anchor plate. Bracing his muddy boots against a granite foundation stone, he pulled back with his entire body weight, using a rusted iron tieback ring in the wall as a makeshift winch to crank the swaying lead counterweight away from the wall. The rough hemp bit deep into his palms, reopening the raw scrape on his thumb and leaving long, burning abrasions across his skin. But he ignored the pain, throwing 3 tight half-hitch knots around the iron ring until the pendulum was securely anchored and the deafening clanging stopped, leaving only the muffled roar of the wind outside. Panting heavily, Arthur leaned against the cold stone wall, his breath misting in the pale beam of the flashlight as a deep, suffocating sense of isolation and regret pressed down upon him. The absolute silence of the cellar, broken only by the drip of groundwater, made him feel completely severed from civilization. He remembered a time just 3 years ago when he sat in a climate-controlled boardroom in downtown Portland, surrounded by digital logistics arrays, directing a fleet of 72 freight trucks across 3 states with a single tap on his tablet. Now, he was hiding in a wet hole in the ground in coastal Maine, bleeding from his hands just to keep a pile of 90-year-old rocks from collapsing on top of him. He thought of his daughter Clara's face during their last real conversation before he left Oregon. The quiet disappointment in her eyes when she realized he couldn't pay her upcoming tuition installment. Her silent rejection when he tried to explain how the market parameters had shifted against him. He had spent his entire life believing that numbers and meticulous planning could shield his family from chaos. But the numbers had lied. His plans had failed, and he was left with nothing but a broken body and a derelict outpost that belonged in a museum. A sharp, rhythmic rap against the floorboards directly above his head snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts, followed by the faint, muffled sound of a car engine idling on the gravel driveway outside. Arthur climbed back up the cellar stairs, his joints aching from the damp cold, and walked to the front door, pulling it open to find a tall, broad-shouldered man standing on the porch, drenched in rain. The man wore a heavy yellow waterproof slicker over a tan uniform, and a silver star pinned to his lapel caught the flashlight beam, Sheriff Thomas Cole Coleman. The sheriff had a weathered, craggy face with sharp gray eyes that immediately scanned Arthur from head to toe, taking in the mud on his boots, the blood on his hands, and the sheer exhaustion etched into his features. "Saw a light up on the ridge from the state highway, and I figured I'd better make sure whoever was trespassing hadn't frozen to death," Cole said, his voice a deep, gravelly New England drawl that carried no hostility, just the cautious pragmatism of a local lawman. Arthur wiped his bloody hands on his jeans and extended an arm. "I'm Arthur Vance, Harlan Vance's grandson. I took over the deed through the probate office last month." Sheriff Cole blinked, a subtle shift passing over his features as he stepped inside the threshold, shaking Arthur's hand with a grip that felt like an iron vice. "Harlan's boy, huh? Didn't think any of the Vance family remembered this ridge existed after the old man passed. He lived up here 40 years, quiet as a stone. Never asked the town for a damn thing." Most folks in Oak Haven think this place is a useless white elephant, an old relic that should have been torn down when the National Weather Service automated the coastal grid back in the 80s. Arthur closed the door against the wind, feeling a defensive spark rise within him. "It's not an elephant to me, Sheriff. It's the only roof I have left." Cole walked over to the desk, his eyes lingering on the modified brass barometer Arthur had found under the desk, before turning back to face him. "Well, if you're planning on staying through the winter, you've got your work cut out for you. This ridge catches the worst of the North Atlantic tracks. But listen, Arthur, since you're a Vance, I'll tell you plain. keep your eyes open. There's been some strange talk down at the town council lately about this land. Folks asking about the access borders. Developers from the southern part of the state sniffing around the ridge lines. Your Uncle Marcus has been talking up a storm at the zoning board about how this property is a safety hazard. Arthur frowned, his logistical mind catching the anomaly. Marcus. He hasn't spoken to my father or my grandfather in 30 years. Why does he care about a defunct weather outpost? Cole pulled a leather-bound notebook from his inner pocket, flipping through it with his thick fingers. Can't say for sure, but he's been buying up old timber plots along the Western Valley stream, and he's been trying to get his hands on Harlan's old manual logs for months. Claimed he wanted them for family sentimentality. But Marcus doesn't have a sentimental bone in his body. Anyway, I came up to check on the structure, but I also wanted to drop this off. The mail carrier down at the crossroads found it jammed in the back of the old rural box at the base of the Ridge Trail. It's addressed to your grandfather, but the postmark is fresh. The sheriff handed Arthur a thick, yellowed parchment envelope. It had no stamp. Just a handwritten name, Harlan Vance, written in a shaky, elegant cursive ink that Arthur didn't recognize. Arthur thanked him, and after a few more practical warnings about the encroaching storm, Sheriff Cole tipped his hat and stepped back out into the rain, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the dense fog as he descended the mountain. Left alone once more. Arthur sat down at the desk under the dim glow of his flashlight, his fingers tracing the coarse fiber of the envelope Cole had given him. He turned it over and carefully slid his thumb under the wax seal on the back. Inside, there was no letter, but rather a single, stiff piece of white plastic attached to a small, heavy rusted iron object. It was an old-fashioned institutional key tag, the kind used in mid-century government facilities or municipal archives. The tag was stamped with a faded blue logo that read, Oak Haven District Surveyor, 1974. And below the logo, someone had scrawled a single room number in permanent black marker, Basement Crypt, Locker 09. Taped directly to the back of the tag was a tiny, jagged piece of a torn topographic map showing a single river bend marked with 3 precise, tiny punctures from a sewing needle. Arthur held the key tag up to the light, his chest tightening as he realized that the key tag itself didn't have a corresponding key attached to it. The metal ring was empty, snapped open by force at some point in the past. Why would someone mail an empty key tag for a town surveyor's locker to a dead meteorologist in the middle of a historic storm? Determined to find where this clue fit into his grandfather's isolated life, Arthur stood up, grabbed his industrial flashlight, and marched back down into the damp cellar, convinced that if Harlan Vance was hiding secrets, they were buried deep in the stone foundation. He systematically searched the perimeter of the underground room, sweeping his light behind old coal shovels, stacks of rotting pine firewood, and crates of empty mason jars. Near the back wall, where the granite blocks met the bedrock of the mountain itself, the flashlight beam caught a massive, dark shape obscured by a heavy tarpaulin that was covered in a thick crust of dried mud and spiderwebs. Arthur grabbed the edge of the canvas and yanked it away, unleashing a thick cloud of choking gray dust that made him cough violently. Revealing itself in the pale light was a massive, military-grade steel filing cabinet painted a dull forest green, standing nearly 6 feet tall. The cabinet was a beast of old-world manufacturing, fireproof and reinforced with heavy iron bands across the seams. On the top drawer, a heavy solid brass padlock, green with age and verdigris, held a thick steel locking bar securely across all 4 handles, sealing the contents away from the world. Arthur stepped closer, wiping the grime from the small brass manufacturer's plate riveted to the center of the iron bar. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the serial numbers stamped into the metal plate. BWR-1982-SYS-04. It was an exact, digit-for-digit match to the hand-engraved serial number on the modified brass barometer he had discovered under the desk upstairs. The cabinet wasn't just a random piece of old office furniture discarded in the cellar. It was part of an integrated coded system that his grandfather had deliberately established and hidden away in 1982, the exact year the town's old logging mills had suddenly shut down without explanation. Arthur reached out and tugged on the brass padlock, but the metal mechanism was frozen solid, rusted shut by 4 decades of subterranean humidity. He shook the iron locking bar, and a heavy, hollow rustle echoed from inside the drawers, the unmistakable sound of hundreds of heavy rolled parchment sheets shifting against the steel casing. He looked down at the empty key tag in his hand, then back at the massive, unyielding padlock that barred his way. The question burned through his mind, sharper and more urgent than before. What history did his grandfather protect up on this isolated peak? And why was his own Uncle Marcus willing to use the authority of the town council to erase it from the mountain? Arthur stared at the green iron sentinel in the dark, knowing that the answers were locked behind that rusted brass. But without a key, he was entirely powerless to open it. The freezing air inside the stone cellar of Blackwood Ridge seemed to thicken as Arthur Vance stood before the massive green iron cabinet, the beam of his industrial steel flashlight reflecting off the ancient layer of grime covering its reinforced seams. His palm still burned from the hemp rope he had used to anchor the wind tower's heavy pendulum dampener, and his injured thumb throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the pounding of the rain against the floorboards overhead. He stared at the brass padlock, its metal frosted with green verdigris, realizing that his grandfather's entire life was sealed behind that iron barrier. To open it, he needed leverage. He turned away from the cabinet and climbed back up the cellar steps, his boots heavy with mud, and walked through the cold instrument room into the attached utility porch where his grandfather had kept his maintenance gear. The space was clutter-filled, smelling of motor oil, dry rot, and old burlap. Arthur searched through a rusted metal toolbox, tossing aside stripped pipe wrenches and frozen pliers until his fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy handle of a classic 36-inch forged steel wrecking bar, a heavy crowbar that his grandfather had likely used to clear ice from the external instrument mounts. He weighed the tool in his hand, feeling a familiar calculation run through his mind. As a logistics manager, he spent his life determining the exact amount of force and resources required to overcome a bottleneck. And right now, this rusted padlock was the ultimate bottleneck to his survival. He marched back down into the damp cellar, the crowbar clinking against the stone walls, and positioned himself directly in front of the green iron cabinet. He jammed the wedged tip of the pry bar into the narrow clearance between the lock's brass shackle and the heavy iron locking bar. He braced his muddy boots against the packed dirt floor, threw his entire 45-year-old frame against the steel handle, and pulled. The rusted brass groaned, but held firm, the metal biting into the crowbar with a screech that echoed like a scream in the enclosed space. Arthur took a deep breath, his muscles straining and sweat breaking out across his forehead despite the near-freezing temperature of the cellar. He thought of his ex-wife Helen's cold words on the phone, her reminder that he was a man who had failed to look at the numbers, a provider who had allowed his daughter's future to evaporate into corporate bankruptcy. The burning humiliation of his financial collapse transformed into a raw physical anger. He surged forward with a desperate final heave, using his shoulder as a fulcrum to maximize the torque against the frozen mechanism. With a loud, explosive snap that sounded like a pistol shot, the ancient brass shackles sheared apart, and the heavy padlock clattered onto the dirt floor,
sending up a small puff of gray dust. Arthur dropped the crowbar, his breath coming in ragged, heavy gasps as he reached out with his trembling, blistered hands to pull the heavy iron locking bar out of its brackets. He grabbed the flush-mounted handles of the top drawer and yanked it forward. The drawer slid open on heavy steel rollers with a deep, hollow rumble that vibrated through the foundation, releasing an immediate, overwhelming scent of aged rag paper, dried linen, drafting ink, and cedar shavings. Inside the drawer, stacked with a terrifyingly meticulous precision that mirrored Arthur's old warehouse inventory systems, were hundreds of heavy, linen-backed, topographic maps, each one meticulously rolled and secured with a faded red cotton ribbon. Arthur's analytical mind instantly recognized the formatting. These weren't standard National Weather Service maps or generic geographical surveys. He pulled the very first roll from the left side of the drawer, his fingers tracing the coarse texture of the linen backing, and brought it up to the desk in the instrument room upstairs where his flashlight could illuminate the details. He untied the red ribbon, and as the heavy paper unrolled across the oak surface, a profound, suffocating wave of grief washed over him. The map was a hand-drawn masterpiece of cartography, executed entirely in his grandfather Harlan's sharp, elegant engineering script. The level of detail was staggering. Every single ridgeline, seasonal stream, public logging path, and historic stone wall of the Oakhaven Valley was recorded with a flawless mathematical accuracy that Arthur hadn't seen since the advent of satellite geographic information systems. But as he looked closer at the date in the corner, October 14th, 1994, Arthur felt a sharp ache in his chest as he remembered exactly where he had been on that date. He had been 23 years old, sitting in a bright, modern university lecture hall in Oregon, completely obsessed with his early logistics career, willfully ignoring the short, handwritten letters his grandfather had sent him from this very ridge. Harlan had reached out to him back then, asking Arthur to use his emerging knowledge of distribution grids to review a set of coordinates. But Arthur had dismissed the old man as a paranoid eccentric who was out of touch with the modern world. Now, standing in the freezing dark of the dead man's house, Arthur realized that while he had been building a fragile corporate empire that would eventually vanish into air, his grandfather had been up here on this mountain, manually preserving a permanent, physical record of the earth beneath their feet. He touched the faded ink signature, Harlan Vance, Regional Surveyor, and a tear slipped down his cheek, smudging the dust on his hand as he realized the true depth of his own arrogance. He had thought his grandfather was the lonely one, but Arthur was the one who was truly isolated, discarded by the modern economy and separated from his family by a wall of failure. He forced his emotions down, his professional eye catching a bizarre structural anomaly on the map sheet. The 1994 chart showed a massive, irregular tract of land along the western boundary of the Oakhaven Municipal Forest, a section known locally as the Whispering Pines watershed. On official state maps Arthur had glanced at during the probate process, this area was designated as a commercial logging zone owned by a regional conglomerate. However, on Harlan's hand-drawn map, the entire baseline boundary had been pushed 300 yards to the east, cutting directly through an old public access road. Harlan had shaded the disputed area with a dense grid of crimson crosshatching, and in the margin,
He had scrawled a series of precise geographic coordinates alongside a single, chilling notation. Stolen boundary. Property of no one. Survey lines altered at district office by fraud. Arthur's breath hitched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the old key tag and the torn piece of map that Sheriff Cole had delivered earlier. He aligned the jagged edge of the torn fragment with the 1994 map on the desk, and his heart stopped. The torn piece was an exact match for the Whispering Pines watershed section, and the 3 tiny punctures from a sewing needle on the fragment perfectly pierced the exact locations of 3 historic stone markers that Harlan had noted as the true, uncorrupted boundary lines of the town. The empty key tag stamped Oak Haven District Surveyor 1974 now took on a terrifying significance. It belonged to a locker in the basement of the town archives, a place where the original physical land deeds were kept before the town transitioned to the digital system. Arthur leaned over the desk, the unanswered question burning through his mind with a fierce intensity. If his grandfather had proven 30 years ago that the town's public lands were being systematically stolen through fraudulent survey lines, why had he kept these maps hidden in a cellar cabinet instead of presenting them to the courts? Why had he allowed the town to believe he was just an obsolete weather observer, while a massive land theft was occurring right beneath his mountain? The silence of the house was suddenly broken by the sharp electronic chime of his phone on the dashboard of his car outside, the signal momentarily bouncing off the storm clouds. Arthur ran out into the pouring rain, ignoring the freezing water that soaked through his flannel shirt, and grabbed the device from the Ford Escape before the connection died again. The screen showed a single incoming text message from his daughter, Clara. Arthur's hands shook as he opened it, his heart aching for any connection to his child. The message read, "Dad, I found an old box of great-grandfather Harlan's letters in the attic while Mom was packing up the house. One of them from 1982 mentions your name. It says he left something specific for you at the station because you were the only one who would understand how to read the lanes. What did he mean? Dad, are you okay up there?" Arthur stared at the glowing text, a profound sense of tentative connection warming his frozen chest as he realized that Clara, despite her anger and her hurt, was still looking for him in the ruins of their family history. He tried to type a reply, his thumb clumsy on the glass, but before he could press send, the signal bars vanished entirely, leaving the message stranded in the outgoing queue. He walked slowly back into the stone house, the phone heavy in his pocket, knowing that he couldn't give Clara an answer until he understood the full scope of the legacy his grandfather had left behind. He returned to the desk, his mind racing as he cross-referenced the 1982 date from Clara's text with the green iron cabinet's serial number, BWR-1982-SYS-04. The year 1982 wasn't just the year the cabinet was built. It was the exact year the Oak Haven Valley Timber Company had suddenly shuttered its doors, plunging hundreds of local families into poverty overnight. Arthur pulled a second map from the cellar roll. This one dated September 1982. It showed the river basin before the logging mills closed, but the natural flow of the stream had been marked with tiny black arrows indicating a sudden, unnatural drop in the water table near the timber lines. Attached to the corner of this map was a small official document, a carbon copy of a land survey receipt signed by a junior field clerk named Marcus Vance. Arthur gasped, his hand dropping to the desk as the pieces of the puzzle began to collide with a terrifying velocity. His Uncle Marcus, the man currently pushing the town council to demolish this weather station, had been the surveyor who validated the original land boundaries back in 1982. The real-world conflict was no longer a distant corporate threat. It was an intimate family betrayal that had shaped the history of the entire valley. Just as Arthur realized the true depth of the danger he was uncovering, a low mechanical rumble echoed from the gravel road at the base of the ridge. He crept to the boarded-up window, peering through a narrow gap in the plywood into the swirling coastal fog below. Through the blinding rain, he saw the twin yellow halogen headlights of a heavy-duty pickup truck idling at the entrance of his access road, its engine purring like a predator waiting in the dark. The vehicle carried no official markings, but a massive steel grille guard was mounted to the front, and as the truck slowly turned its high beams directly toward the stone weather station, the brilliant light illuminated a large, handwritten warning sign that someone had freshly nailed to the wooden gatepost at the edge of his property line. The bold black letters glistening in the wet cold. Leave the ridge before the cables snap. The morning following the peak of the storm brought no warmth to Blackwood Ridge, only a heavy gray ceiling of low-hanging sea fog that swallowed the tops of the white pines and turned the old stone weather station into an isolated island in the sky. Arthur Vance woke up stiffly in his grandfather's armchair, his fingers cold and the skin across his blistered palms tight and sore from the previous night's desperate struggle with the heavy hemp rope and the old iron stabilization pendulum. He checked his phone. The battery was hovering at 12%, and the screen still read, "No service." The text message from his daughter Clara remaining frozen in the outbound queue like an unanswered plea. He looked toward the boarded-up window where the plywood patch held firm against the damp breeze. Then down at the heavy oak desk where the hand-drawn map from 1994 lay spread out alongside the mysterious yellowed envelope and the empty surveyor's key tag. The warning sign he had seen at the gatepost, the crude black lettering telling him to leave before the cables snapped, seemed less like a theatrical threat and more like a calculated logistical tactic designed to exploit his vulnerability. As a former logistics manager who had spent 25 years assessing operational vulnerabilities, he knew that a threat was only issued when an adversary was desperate to prevent an audit. The truck he had seen idling in the blinding rain had vanished by dawn, leaving behind deep, rutted tire tracks in the freezing mud. But the real-world conflict had crystallized with terrifying clarity. His Uncle Marcus wasn't just a distant, unlikable relative. He was actively using his position on the Oak Haven zoning board to erase whatever historical truth Arthur's grandfather had spent 40 years manually recording on this mountain. Arthur knew he couldn't sit in the freezing house waiting for his car battery or his spirit to die. He needed baseline data, historical verification, and a human connection to a town that currently viewed him as an intrusive outsider. He packed the 1994 map and the 1974 key tag into a protective oilskin sleeve, threw on his damp canvas jacket, and walked out to his sputtering Ford Escape. The engine cranked heavily 3 times before catching, its worn exhaust pipe puffing a white plume of condensation into the dense fog as he began the slow, treacherous descent down the rutted mountain road toward the valley floor. The small coastal town of Oak Haven looked bleak under the heavy October overcast, its brick storefronts quiet, and the local harbor filled with bobbing wooden lobster boats tied down against the seasonal swells. Arthur parked in front of the Oak Haven Municipal Library and Historical Archives, a modest red brick building with tall, arched windows that sat near the edge of the tidal river basin. His boots clopped hollowly against the damp stone steps as he entered, the heavy oak doors closing behind him to seal out the salt air, replacing it with the comforting, dusty aroma of aged leather bindings, microfiche, chemicals, and wood polish. The interior was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of a desktop computer behind the main desk, where a woman sat reviewing a stack of old property folios. Evelyn Finch, the town archivist, looked up as Arthur approached, her sharp blue eyes peering over a pair of tortoise-shell reading glasses. She was 68 years old, with silver hair tied back in a neat bun, and a face lined with the quiet determination of someone who had spent her life guarding the collective memory of a community that was slowly being eroded by time and modern development. "Can I help you find something specific? Or are you just seeking shelter from the fog?" she asked, her voice carrying a dry, melodic New England pragmatism that lacked the superficial warmth of corporate customer service, but possessed a deep, inherent curiosity. Arthur removed his wet cap and stepped closer, feeling a sudden, intense wave of vulnerability as he realized how ragged he must look to her, his clothes stained with cellar mud, his hands wrapped in crude gauze, and his face drawn from lack of sleep. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said quietly, his voice raspy. "I'm Harlan Vance's grandson. I recently took over the old weather outpost on the ridge." Evelyn froze, her pen stopping mid-air as she looked at him with an entirely new intensity, her gaze softening from professional skepticism into a deep, historical recognition. "Harlan's boy," she murmured, standing up from her desk, her long woolen skirt rustling against the linoleum. "The town council said someone had claimed the old deed, but Marcus insisted it was just a corporate speculator looking to flip the acreage. Nobody told me it was family." "Come back here, Arthur. You look like you've been fighting the mountain and losing." She led him past the standard reference stacks into a private, wood-paneled research alcove at the rear of the archives, where a vintage microfilm reader sat surrounded by boxes of uncatalogued regional records. This ran right into their first real relationship scene as she pulled a ceramic mug from a small heating element and poured him a cup of black chicory coffee, the hot liquid warming his chapped hands as he took a seat at the heavy long table. "Your grandfather was a difficult man, Arthur. But he was a just man," Evelyn said, sitting across from him, her eyes tracking the oilskin sleeve he had placed on the table. "When he died 6 months ago, the town council wanted to seal his personal files immediately, claiming they were municipal meteorological property. I managed to classify them as personal family heritage to keep Marcus's lawyers from shredding them, but I didn't know if anyone would ever come to read them." "Why are you here, Arthur?" "A man doesn't move onto Blackwood Ridge in October unless he's running out of road." The question hit Arthur with an unexpected emotional weight, breaching the professional defenses he had maintained since his logistics company collapsed. He looked down at the dark surface of the coffee, his voice dropping to an absolute whisper. "I lost everything, Evelyn," he confessed, the admission ripping a hole in his remaining pride, but providing a strange, therapeutic relief. "My business went bankrupt 3 months ago. The bank took the house, my wife took the divorce, and my daughter Clara, she's working double shifts at a library just to survive, because the college fund I spent 20 years building evaporated overnight. I didn't come to this ridge to find an inheritance. I came because it was the only piece of dirt on earth where a debt collector couldn't evict me. I thought my grandfather was crazy for spending 40 years up there alone. But standing in that cold house, looking at his work, I'm starting to realize that he was the only Vance who actually knew what he was anchoring himself to. I've spent my whole life calculating logistics for companies that didn't care about the people on the ground. And now I'm completely redundant." Evelyn watched him in silence for a long moment, her hand reaching across the table to briefly touch his scarred wrist with a maternal validation that made his throat tighten with a sudden, overwhelming grief. "You aren't redundant to this history, Arthur," she said softly. Harlan always told me that the modern world would eventually run out of numbers and have to return to the dirt. He was waiting for you, even if he never said it out loud. This deep emotional connection gave Arthur the grounding he needed to transition to his practical challenge. He unzipped the oilskin sleeve and carefully unrolled the hand-drawn 1994 map across the research table, pinning the corners down with two heavy leather-bound local histories. Evelyn leaned forward, her glasses sliding down her nose as she studied the intricate crimson cross-hatching along the Whispering Pines watershed border. "This is what I found in the cellar green iron cabinet," Arthur explained, pointing to the hand-drawn grid lines that shifted the town's public forest boundary 300 yards to the east. "And this arrived in the rural mailbox yesterday." He placed the 1974 key tag and the tiny needle-punctured map fragment beside the large chart. Evelyn took a sharp, audible breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the faded blue stamp that read, "Oak Haven District Surveyor, 1974. "God help us," she whispered, looking toward the heavy locked steel door that led down to the archive's subterranean storage vault. "This tag belongs to the old basement crypt lockers. That's where the original colony land grants and handwritten town charters from the 19th century are kept. In 1974, the county automated the land registry, moving everything to digital databases down in the county seat. But the physical witness tree surveys and original boundary descriptions were supposed to remain locked down there as a legal backup. If your grandfather had this tag, it means he was down there pulling records before the lockers were cleared out. Arthur's logistical mind immediately calculated the immediate operational obstacle. Can we go down there? If the original deeds match these crimson lines, it proves the modern digital registry is a fraud. Evelyn shook her hand, her expression turning grim. The town council passed an ordinance 3 months ago, sponsored by Marcus, restricting all subterranean archive access to certified municipal officers due to an alleged structural mold issue in the foundation. The key to that basement door is kept in a digital lockbox at the town manager's office, and if I try to request it without a formal court order, Marcus will know within 5 minutes. But we don't need the basement locker to find the first piece of the truth. Arthur, we need to look at what happened before the survey lines were shifted. She stood up and marched over to a wall of gray metal cabinets containing old local newspaper microfilm reels, pulling a small cardboard box labeled Oak Haven Press, July to December 1975. She navigated the practical challenge of mounting the brittle acetate film onto the reader's spools, her fingers working the manual cranks with a practiced familiarity until the illuminated screen displayed the grainy black and white pages of the July 17, 1975 edition. She scrolled past advertisements for long-defunct hardware stores and local fishing reports until she reached the editorial section on page 4. The headline read, "Ridge Observer Questions Valley Boundary Shifts. Town Council Calls Metrics Unscientific." The article described a bitter public dispute during an emergency town council meeting where a 34-year-old Harlan Vance, serving as the resident meteorologist and auxiliary land steward, had formally accused the regional timber syndicate of illegally clearing old-growth cedar trees beyond their permitted parcel lines in the Whispering Pines Basin. Harlan had presented manual rainfall runoff charts and soil absorption logs from the weather station to prove that the logging operations were causing severe, unnatural erosion that was systematically altering the course of the valley stream, the very stream used to define the town's legal property borders. The town council, led by a young, ambitious developer named Thomas Vance, Marcus's father, had dismissed Harlan's manual data as obsolete, replacing his findings with a brand new, computerized geographic survey that effectively moved the public boundary lines to encompass the eroded land. legally gifting the timber syndicate 300 acres of public municipal forest. Arthur leaned closer to the microfilm screen, his analytical eye tracking a small, buried paragraph at the bottom of the column. The writer noted that 2 weeks after the meeting, a young field clerk named Marcus Vance had been officially hired by the district surveyor's office to oversee the final digitization of all historical Valley land grants. This old newspaper document served as an ironclad clue, providing the missing link between his grandfather's weather observations and the geographic fraud. Harlan doesn't tracking simple weather trends. He was using microclimate rain data to document the deliberate physical manipulation of the landscape by a family dynasty that was using corporate automation to disguise a systemic land theft. The mystery progression was accelerating, but it raised an even deeper, unanswered question in Arthur's mind. If Harlan had documented this fraud in 1975, why did he wait until 1982 to build the green iron cabinet? And why did he leave the maps hidden in a cellar for another 40 years instead of taking them to federal authorities? What was the final piece of evidence he was missing up on that ridge that kept him silent until his death? He couldn't fight them alone, Arthur, Evelyn said quietly, as if reading his thoughts, her hand gently turning off the microfilm reader's lamp, plunging the alcove into the gray light of the afternoon fog. In 1975, this town depended entirely on the timber syndicate for survival. If Harlan had shut down the logging lines by proving the boundary fraud, he would have destroyed the livelihood of every family in the valley. He chose to wait, manually logging the earth, saving the proof until the timber contracts ran dry and the town could look at the truth without starving. He sacrificed his reputation and his family relationships to protect the valley's long-term survival, keeping the records pristine until someone with the technical capacity to audit the lines arrived. He was waiting for you, Arthur. The realization of his grandfather's silent, multi-decade sacrifice filled Arthur with a profound sense of awe, his tentative connection to the dead man deepening into a quiet, emergent obligation. He rolled the 1994 map back into its sleeve, his fingers no longer shaking, replaced by a steady, growing determination to see the audit through to the final line. He thanked Evelyn, promising to return as soon as he had cataloged the remaining rolls in the cellar, and walked back out into the main archive room toward the front exit. As he passed the central display case where the town's official modern digital land map was proudly showcased under glass for public reference, Arthur stopped, his eyes locking onto the lower right corner of the large, glossy plot sheet. The map was dated January 2024, representing the current legal boundaries used to approve the upcoming regional resort development on the ridgelines. There, stamped in official blue ink alongside the municipal seal, was the required validation signature from the current chairman of the zoning board. Arthur's blood turned to ice as he stared at the familiar, aggressive handwriting. The signature didn't belong to Marcus Vance, nor did it belong to any corporate developer from the South. The modern map that legally authorized the destruction of Blackwood Ridge had been formally signed and validated by his own ex-wife's lead bankruptcy attorney, a man who had secretly been on Marcus's payroll since the day Vance Global Logistics first began to collapse in Portland. The realization shattered any remaining illusion of coincidence, leaving a chilling, new, unanswered question hanging in the damp air of the archive room. His financial ruin wasn't just a failure of the market. His life had been systematically dismantled from the inside out by the very people who needed him, broke, isolated, and desperate enough to abandon the inheritance his grandfather had died to protect. The relentless, damp chill of the coastal Maine fog clung to the granite walls of the Blackwood Ridge station as Arthur Vance climbed out of his vehicle, his boots sinking into the deep, muddy ruts left by the mysterious truck from the night before. His chest carried a strange, unaccustomed warmth despite the raw wind, a fragile, emergent spark of hope that had taken root during his conversation with Evelyn Finch in the quiet alcove of the town archives. For the first time since his logistics firm crumbled into a heap of debt and broken promises, Arthur didn't feel entirely disposable. His highly specialized analytical skills, the sharp eye for microdata and spatial coordination that had once directed massive freight networks, were the exact tools needed to decipher the spatial puzzle his grandfather had left behind. He entered the dark instrument room, the scent of old wood smoke and damp cedar welcoming him like a silent co-conspirator. The practical challenge of the morning immediately presented itself when he noticed that the mechanical microbarograph on the side table, a purely low-tech, weight-driven instrument that recorded atmospheric pressure onto a rotating paper drum via an ink-tipped brass arm, had jammed. Its gears frozen solid by the overnight drop in temperature and the salt moisture leaking through the floorboards. Arthur pulled on his worn canvas work gloves, kneeling beside the cast-iron casing of the device, and used a slender sewing machine needle and a small vial of whale oil he found in the desk drawer to meticulously clear the microscopic crust of rust and hardened grease from the brass escapement wheel. His hands shook slightly from the cold, and the raw scrape on his thumb throbbed in protest. But he refused to stop, applying pressure with a surgical precision until the weight clicked. The internal mainspring engaged, and the brass arm began its slow, rhythmic sweep across the grid paper once more. Seeing the obsolete machine return to life filled him with a profound emotional intensity as he sat back on his heels, staring at his dirty, scarred fingers. He remembered how his own father, a pragmatic suburban contractor in Oregon, had always praised Uncle Marcus's family as the true builders of the Vance lineage, while routinely dismissing grandfather Harlan as a reclusive eccentric who had abandoned his familial duties to chase shadows on a useless mountain. Arthur had internalized that corporate metric for 45 years, believing that a man's worth was calculated solely by the square footage of his real estate and the velocity of his capital. Now, looking at the flawless mechanical integrity of the station, he realized that Harlan hadn't been an eccentric failure. He had been a meticulous guardian who sacrificed his own family standing to preserve an uncorrupted physical record of the valley when everyone else was selling their heritage by the acre. Arthur stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room, and transitioned into his primary task, carefully clearing the large oak desk to spread out the hand-drawn map from 1982 alongside the modern digital resort blueprint he had copied from the archive case. The mystery progression was entering a critical phase. At 35% velocity, the baseline data was beginning to line up against the official town records, but he still lacked the human context to understand the immediate impact of the boundary shifts. The silence of the ridge was broken by the wet, heavy crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway outside, followed by a hesitant, rhythmic knock on the heavy oak door. Arthur reached for the steel wrecking bar leaning against the hearth, his muscles tensing as he pulled the door open. But instead of Marcus or his henchman, he found an elderly man standing on the porch, wrapped in a faded, oil-stained wool Mackinaw jacket. The man was short and stooped, with white hair escaping from a soiled ball cap that read, Oak Haven Timber Company. Retired, and his face was a map of deep, wind-burnt lines that spoke of 50 years of hard manual labor in the elements. "You must be Arthur," the old man said, his voice a dry, whistling wheeze that carried the sharp scent of pipe tobacco and peppermint. "I'm Ben Miller. I saw your old Ford down at the library archives earlier, and Evelyn told me you were up here trying to live in Harlan's old skin. I used to be the head high climber for the Valley Timber Mill back in '82, before the whole operation went dark overnight. I figured you ought to see a face that actually remembers why your grandfather stayed up on this rock when the rest of the world turned its back on him. Arthur lowered the iron bar, a wave of relief washing over him as he invited Ben inside. The two men sitting across from each other at the long pine kitchen table in a raw, honest relationship scene that grounded the growing tension of the mystery. Ben looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the boarded-up window and the cold stone hearth with a quiet familiarity. Harlan was the only soul in this county who didn't lie to us, Arthur, Ben said, his rough, calloused hands gripping the warm ceramic mug of chicory coffee Arthur poured for him. In the summer of '82, when the timber syndicate claimed the wells were drying up and use of the public valley stream had to be restricted, Marcus Vance was the young surveyor who brought in the automated engineering charts showing that our family plots were legally sitting inside the company's new drainage basin. We were told we had to sign over our timber rights or face a total buyout. Everyone down in the village thought Harlan was just a crazy old man because he kept coming down from the ridge with his manual rain buckets and his soil logs, screaming that the water wasn't disappearing. It was being diverted by illegal ditches hidden in the upper forest. The town council laughed him out of the room, called his metrics outdated science, and forced the mill to shut down to clear the titles. But what folks don't know, what Marcus has spent 40 years trying to keep buried, is that after the mill closed and my family lost everything, an anonymous bank draft arrived in our mailbox every single month for 3 years, just enough to keep the bank from taking our cabin. It wasn't until after Harlan passed 6 months ago that I found an old deposit receipt in the church ledger proving that those drafts came directly from your grandfather's tiny Federal Observer stipend. He lived on salt pork and dry beans up here, freezing in the winter, just so he could secretly keep 3 families from starving after they were broken by his brother's land fraud. The revelation hit Arthur like a physical weight, his heart aching with a deep, systemic grief as he looked at the old timber worker. Realizing that his grandfather's life hadn't just been about tracking coordinates or weather lines, it was an invisible, multi-decade sacrifice of pure human decency. Harlan had allowed the community to view him as a pariah so that he could maintain his legal standing as a neutral federal observer, using his small income to shield the very people who ridiculed him. Ben reached into his heavy jacket pocket and pulled out a worn, oilcloth document sleeve, placing it gently on the table between them like a sacred relic. Harlan told me 40 years ago that if anyone from his bloodline ever returned to this mountain with an honest eye, I was to give them this, Ben said quietly. His gray eyes locked onto Arthur's face with an unblinking intensity. It's the field log from the exact week the mill lines were shifted in September of '82. Marcus thought he burned the originals when he cleared out the surveyor's office, but Harlan had already copied the baseline coordinates into this sleeve. Arthur took the cloth sleeve, his fingers tracing the coarse, greasy material as Ben stood up, tipped his cap, and walked back out into the gathering sea fog, leaving Arthur alone with the physical evidence of his family's hidden truth. Arthur returned to the oak desk, his analytical logistics mind switching on with a fierce, burning determination as he pulled the handwritten ledger sheets from the cloth sleeve and aligned them with the 1982 map and the modern digital resort layout. He began to cross-reference the hand-drawn survey markers with the legal property descriptions, his technical eye instantly picking up a staggering human-scale anomaly that had been entirely omitted from the modern digital databases. The crimson boundary lines that his grandfather had marked didn't just encompass random timber acreage. The shifted coordinates precisely cut through a forgotten 3-acre parcel located at the base of the western slope, a section listed in the 1982 ledger as the St. Jude Immigrant Cemetery and Schoolhouse Plot. It had been a historic public sanctuary established in the 1910s for the families of the Irish and Italian stonemasons who had carved the very foundation blocks of the weather station. In the modern digital blueprint that Marcus had validated, that entire historic cemetery had been completely wiped from the map, its geographic existence erased from the public record so that the land title could be declared vacant public land and legally transferred to the southern resort developers for a golf course. Arthur leaned over the desk, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the full scope of the stolen legacy bared itself before him. His family dynasty hadn't just stolen timber or water, they had desecrated the graves of the forgotten people who built the town, erasing an entire community's history to clear the way for a corporate playground. The emotional arc was shifting from curiosity to a profound, unshakable determination. Arthur realized that by saving this weather station, he wasn't just fighting for a roof over his head or a way to escape his debts. He was fighting to restore the dignity of the dead and the living who had been systematically crushed by his uncle's greed. He looked at the 2024 digital map, his eyes tracing the aggressive signature of his ex-wife's attorney, and a chilling new unanswered question began to wrap itself around his thoughts. How deep did this network of corporate predation actually go? And if they were willing to dismantle his own logistics company in Portland just to keep him from interfering with the Ridge title, what would they do when they realized he had already found the true boundary lines? The silence of the stone house was suddenly violated by a sharp, metallic scratching sound that seemed to originate from inside the heavy iron fireplace flue. Arthur caught his breath, grabbing his industrial flashlight and stepping toward the hearth, his heart hammering against his ribs as he peered up into the dark. Soot-choked chimney. He reached his gauzed hand into the narrow opening, his fingers groping along the rough stone ledger until they struck a loose iron lever, the old seasonal damper plate that had been rusted shut for decades. With a harsh, muscular twist, he yanked the plate downward, and a heavy, tightly sealed zinc box clattered out of the flue, slamming into the gray ash heap and releasing a thick cloud of black dust that made him cough violently. Arthur knelt in the soot, his hands trembling as he pried open the corroded latches of the zinc container. Inside, wrapped in a piece of scorched canvas, there was no treasure or money, but a single folded document dated November 12, 1982. It was a formal, personal cease and desist letter written on the official letterhead of Vance Construction in Portland, signed in bold, unmistakable ink by Arthur's own deceased father, Thomas Vance. The letter was addressed directly to Harlan, and the words cut through Arthur's remaining illusions like a razor. Harlan, if you present these manual boundary logs to the county judge, you will ruin Marcus's career and destroy the family business before it can start. I've already spoken to the district doctors down at the asylum in Augusta. If you don't lock these maps in your cellar and keep your mouth shut about the watershed borders, I will personally sign the civil commitment papers to have you declared mentally incompetent due to senile delusions. Do not test me on this, brother. The family lines stay where Marcus drew them. Arthur sat back in the cold soot, the letter fluttering in his hand as a terrible, suffocating silence descended upon the ridge, leaving him with a shattering new revelation. His own father hadn't been an innocent bystander in the family ruin. He had actively helped blackmail his own brother into silence, using the threat of a lunatic asylum to bury the truth that Arthur was now holding in his hands. The smoke from the blackmail letter Arthur Vance held in his soot-stained hand seemed to linger in the freezing air of the instrument room, mixing with the sharp smell of kerosene and old paper. The words written by his own father in 1982 had shattered the final, fragile illusion of his childhood, exposing the comfortable life he had grown up with in Portland as a direct byproduct of a cold, systemic betrayal. He sat in his grandfather's sagging armchair, the zinc box resting heavily on his lap, feeling a profound sense of determination hardening within his chest. He was no longer just a bankrupt logistics manager hiding from debt collectors. He was the custodian of an uncorrupted history. And the numbers he needed to audit were no longer commercial shipping manifests, but the moral debts of his own lineage. The immediate practical challenge of the night forced its way through his existential shock as the ancient internal heating system of the stone cottage, a finicky gravity-fed Carol jet heater from the late 1950s, suddenly gave a wet, sputtering gasp and died. The internal temperature of the room began to plunge instantly, the moisture from the sea fog outside condensing into a fine glaze of frost along the interior stone walls. Arthur pulled his canvas gloves back on, kneeling before the iron access panel of the heater. The glass fuel gauge tube was completely clogged with a thick, amber sludge of degraded paraffin and rust particles from the baseline tank. Using a slender copper wire he stripped from an old piece of telegraph cable on the workbench and a small piece of steel wool, he meticulously cleaned the microscopic orifice of the fuel jet, his fingers growing numb from the freezing steel as he cleared the old buildup. He had to apply pressure with an exact mechanical precision, knowing that if he cracked the antique porcelain igniter rod, the station would become entirely uninhabitable before dawn. After 20 minutes of focused, agonizing manipulation, the fuel line clicked clear. The jet whistled, and when he struck a match, the burner erupted into a steady, bright blue ring of flame, casting a warm, flickering glow across the hand-drawn maps on the desk. This physical victory brought a wave of emotional intensity as he sat back on the floorboards, staring at the blue fire. He remembered his father, Thomas, as a loud, charismatic man who always smelled of expensive cologne and structural pine. A man who built subdivisions and spoke about family loyalty as if it were an unassailable law. Arthur had spent his entire adulthood trying to earn that man's approval, replicating his aggressive business tactics in the Portland logistics market, believing that financial success was the ultimate proof of character. Now, holding the evidence that his father had threatened to commit his own brother to an asylum to protect a fraudulent land grant, Arthur felt a sickening realization wash over him. His entire life had been patterned after a lie. His corporate bankruptcy wasn't a sudden cosmic injustice. It was the inevitable collapse of a philosophy that valued boundaries over people. The silence of the mountain was suddenly shattered by the sharp, heavy crunch of a vehicle pulling onto the gravel driveway outside. The bright, blinding glare of modern LED high beams slicing through the gaps in the boarded-up bay window. A car door slammed with a heavy, expensive thud, followed by the firm, deliberate click of leather-soled shoes ascending the stone porch steps. Arthur did not reach for the crowbar this time. He stood up, his posture straight and his eyes calm as the front door handle jiggled. And then a heavy, silver-plated key turned in the lock. The door swung open, and Marcus Vance stepped into the threshold, shaking the light mist from the collar of his tailored cashmere overcoat. At 58, Marcus looked like a man who had successfully conquered the transition from local land surveyor to regional political broker. His silver hair perfectly styled, his teeth blindingly white, and an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence that made the small stone room feel instantly cramped. This ran directly into their first adversarial relationship scene, as Marcus stepped inside without an invitation, closing the heavy oak door behind him and scanning the room with a practiced, predatory eye that instantly noted the unrolled 1982 maps, the zinc box, and the soot on Arthur's hands. "You always did have your father's stubborn streak, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone that carried a patronizing warmth, like an executive delivering a severance package. But Thomas also knew when a shipping lane was closed. I looked at the probate filings in Portland. "You've got 3 regional banks preparing to file a secondary attachment on your personal property by the end of the month, and your daughter's university account is currently 60 days past due. You're living like a vagrant in a cold shack because you think there's some kind of romantic legacy up on this ridge. Let's speak plainly. Nephew to uncle. This station is an obsolete pile of stones, a safety hazard that the county wants demolished. I'm here because we're blood, and I'm prepared to offer you an exit lane." Marcus reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, embossed leather document folder, laying it open on the oak desk directly over Harlan's hand-drawn survey lines. Inside was a certified cashier's check from a regional trust bank, the numbers printed in crisp, automated black ink. $150,000. Arthur stared at the check, a powerful, suffocating wave of temptation crashing through his defenses. That money would instantly clear his immediate personal liabilities, settle Clara's tuition deficit for the next 2 years, and allow him to return to Oregon with his dignity superficially intact. He wouldn't have to freeze on this mountain, wouldn't have to fight a corrupt town council, and wouldn't have to face the dark history of his family. He looked up at Marcus, his logistical mind analyzing the older man's facial micro-expressions, the slight, tense twitch in the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes kept darting toward the closed cellar door near the pantry. Marcus wasn't offering a charity buyout. He was terrified. Arthur stepped closer to the desk, his hands resting on the edge of the timber surface. "Why is the validation signature on the 2024 resort blueprint signed by my ex-wife's bankruptcy attorney?" "Marcus," Arthur asked, his voice dead calm, dropping the question into the room like a physical weight. Marcus didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed, the superficial warmth instantly evaporating from his face, leaving behind the cold, ruthless calculation of a man who had spent 40 years shifting boundaries in the dark. "A good developer secures his supply chains before he clearing the ground, Arthur," Marcus said softly, stepping closer until he was inches away. "Your logistics firm didn't collapse because of a random market shift. It collapsed because you were looking at global lanes while someone else was buying up the local titles. Your attorney was simply facilitating a necessary reallocation of resources. You don't belong on this ridge, Arthur. You're a city manager whose numbers ran out. Take the check, sign the voluntary deed relinquishment form inside that folder, and go back to Portland to be a father to your girl before she forgets your name." The mention of Clara's name, used as a leverage point by the very man who had engineered his financial ruin, caused something to snap inside Arthur. The emotional arc reached its definitive midpoint anchor of pure determination. He reached out, picked up the leather folder, and deliberately closed it, pushing the $150,000 check back across the desk toward his uncle. "My grandfather stayed up here for 40 years because he understood that some lines can't be bought, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice rising with an unshakable, clear authority that surprised even himself. He manually logged every foot of the Whispering Pines watershed. He documented the illegal drainage ditches you surveyed in '82. He knew you erased the St. Jude Immigrant Cemetery from the public grant just to clear the title for a golf course. "I'm not signing the deed over to you. I'm staying right here and I'm going to audit every single survey line you validated since the day you cleared out the surveyor's office. Marcus stared at him for a long, terrifying moment. The silence between them filled only by the low, steady hum of the kerosene heater. Then, Marcus leaned over the desk, his hand coming down onto the leather folder with a soft, ominous slap. "You think those hand-drawn sheets are a shield, Arthur? They're nothing but old paper in a dry room," Marcus whispered, his voice turning entirely cold as he let slip a crucial piece of information that served as the primary clue of the confrontation. Harlan was a fool who died thinking he could protect those cellar files by putting a brass lock on a green iron cabinet. But the county automated the grid 40 years ago, and a physical ledger doesn't exist in the eyes of a modern land court unless it matches the digital grant down in the district basement. Old stone houses on this ridge catch fire very easily during the dry autumn freezes. Nephew, the wind up here is relentless, and when a structure burns, the ash looks exactly the same whether it was a weather station or an old family secret. I'll see you at the emergency zoning hearing on Thursday morning. Bring your maps if you want, but remember, the dirt always buries what the sky forgets. Marcus turned on his heel, pulling his cashmere coat tight around his shoulders, and walked out into the sea fog, the heavy oak door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the brass barometer on the desk. Arthur stood alone in the center of the flickering blue light, his chest heaving as the pickup truck's engine roared to life outside, its headlights sweeping across the stone walls before vanishing down the mountain road. The confrontation had provided a massive shift in the mystery velocity, pushing the revelation to 45%. But it left a chilling, critical, unanswered question hanging in the freezing air of the instrument room. Marcus had explicitly revealed that he knew about the green iron cabinet and the cellar files. Yet he hadn't used force to break into the cellar tonight to destroy them himself. Why was he waiting for the Thursday morning town council meeting to execute his final move? And what specific legal authority did he possess within the digital land registry that made him so confident that Harlan's physical maps would be laughed out of a modern court? Arthur looked down at the empty surveyor's key tag resting on the oak desk, realizing that the ultimate battle for the valley wouldn't be fought on this mountain, but down in the dark, restricted basement crypt of the town archives, where the digital automated system had first been corrupted. The morning following the brutal confrontation with Marcus Vance brought a sudden violent drop in temperature that turned the dense sea fog into a wicked horizontal freezing rain, slicking the granite facade of the Blackwood Ridge station with a thick coat of ice. Arthur Vance stood in the center of the instrument room, his body trembling slightly from a deep, pervasive exhaustion that seemed to settle directly into his bones. The blue ring of flame from the newly repaired kerosene heater cast long dancing shadows across the oak desk, where his father's 1982 blackmail letter lay next to the empty surveyor's key tag and the zinc container. Arthur's hands, wrapped in coarse gray cotton gauze, were stiff and stained with black chimney soot. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of the setback that had just paralyzed his logistics mind. He realized that his Uncle Marcus held an ironclad structural advantage. In a modern land court, his grandfather Harlan's beautiful, hand-drawn linen maps were legally non-existent because they didn't populate the official municipal servers down at the county seat. The modern, automated world didn't just render old men obsolete. It actively erased their physical records from the historical matrix, leaving a bankrupt outcast like Arthur with no legal standing to protect the very peak he was standing on. To make matters worse, his phone had completely died during the night, its screen black and dead, cutting off his singular, tentative connection to his daughter, Clara, just as she had reached out to him across the ruins of their family history. he felt a terrifying wave of regression, a sudden descent back into the hollow, paralyzing grief that had consumed him when his logistics firm vanished in Portland. He wasn't auditing a supply chain. He was standing in a freezing tomb, completely isolated, surrounded by old paper that carried no weight in a world governed by digital titles and corporate lawyers. The practical challenge of the morning forced its way through his emotional paralysis when a sudden, thunderous crack echoed from the roof overhead, followed by the harsh, scraping sound of heavy iron twisting under an immense load. The freezing rain had coated the external lattice of the 40-foot anemometer tower in a 2-inch shell of solid ice, creating a massive weight imbalance that was physically warping the iron frame against the stone chimney. If the tower collapsed, it would smash through the roof timbers, destroying the main instrument room and burying the green iron cabinet beneath a mountain of rubble before he could index a single remaining map. Arthur knew he couldn't wait for the storm to clear. He had to act with the same structural calculation he used to salvage derailed freight lines. He grabbed a heavy wooden mallet, an old hemp safety line, and an iron scaling ladder from the porch, stepping out onto the wind-swept stone terrace into the blinding sheet of freezing rain. The wind slammed into his chest like a physical wall, knocking the breath from his lungs and instantly freezing the moisture on his eyelashes as he strapped the hemp line around his waist, anchoring it to the stone lintel of the door. He placed the scaling ladder against the icy lattice of the tower, his boots slipping on the ruts left by Marcus's truck as he began the treacherous ascent into the freezing sky. Every step was an agony of cold. The iron rungs were coated in smooth, glassy ice, and his blistered hands screamed in protest as he gripped the frozen metal. The wind howling around him with a deafening, predatory roar. He climbed 20 feet into the air, the tower swaying violently beneath him, until he reached the primary support strut where the ice buildup was thickest. Bracing his knees against the shaking lattice, Arthur swung the heavy wooden mallet with his remaining physical strength, shattering the ice casing with a succession of sharp, explosive blows that sent heavy, frozen shards plunging down onto the stone terrace below. The work was brutal, his breath pluming in the gray air, but he refused to stop until the iron framework straightened. The structural load subsided, and the copper wind cups at the summit began to spin with a smooth, rhythmic rotation once more. He descended the ladder slowly, his body shaking with an uncontrollable chill, and slid down against the oak door, his face stinging from the ice, but his mind suddenly clear. The physical victory reviving a small, stubborn spark of determination within his chest. This physical exhaustion ran directly into an unexpected relationship scene 20 minutes later, when a mud-splattered county sheriff's cruiser slowly ascended the gravel driveway, its tires chains clanking heavily against the frozen ground. Sheriff Thomas Cole Coleman climbed out of the vehicle, his heavy tan winter jacket zipped to his chin, and his face grim as he marched onto the porch, carrying a formal clipboard wrapped in a clear plastic sheet to protect it from the freezing rain. Cole stepped inside the threshold without his usual pragmatic drawl, his eyes avoiding Arthur's gaze as he placed the clipboard on the desk, directly over the 1982 ledger sheets that Ben Miller had delivered. "I'm sorry to bring this up the mountain today of all days, Arthur," Cole said, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register that carried the heavy weight of a forced official duty. But Marcus went down to the county magistrate in Machias first thing this morning. He presented a certified digital title extract showing that the weather station's parcel has been flagged as abandoned municipal property due to a catastrophic structural failure of the primary weather tracking arrays. The town council just issued a summary emergency abatement order. You've got 48 hours to clear your personal belongings from this structure before the county line crews arrive to board up the doors and disconnect the utility lines. Marcus has a demolition permit pre-approved for Thursday noon. I told the mayor this was a dirty trick to run you off before the zoning hearing, but the paperwork is clean. Arthur, in the eyes of the state, this place doesn't exist as a dwelling anymore because it doesn't have an active digital link to the regional network. I can't protect you from a lawful court order, son. The news hit Arthur like a physical blow, stripping away the small sense of security he had fought so hard to build over the last 3 weeks, leaving him with an absolute sense of defeat as he looked at the official county eviction notice. The system his father and uncle had built 40 years ago was working exactly as intended, using automated regulations to crush any human resistance before it could articulate itself in a courtroom. After Sheriff Cole left, his cruiser's red taillights vanishing into the blinding gray fog, Arthur sat in the darkening room, his eyes tracing the hand-annotated markings on the brass barometer. He felt a deep, hollow despair. The setback was total. His time had run out, and he was completely powerless against the corporate machinery that Marcus wielded. He stood up, his movements slow and mechanical, and walked down into the damp cellar one last time, intending to pack the maps into his duffel bags before the county crews arrived to seal the hatch. As he swept his flashlight beam across the packed dirt floor near the base of the green iron cabinet, the light caught a strange object that had been dislodged when the heavy iron pendulum slammed into the anchor plate during the peak of the storm. A small, triangular piece of weathered granite had fractured away from the bottom corner of the foundation wall, revealing a narrow, hollow cavity built directly into the bedrock beneath the stone course. Arthur knelt in the cold mud, his heart tensing with a sudden, sharp curiosity as he reached his gauzed hand into the narrow opening, his fingers brushing against the coarse texture of a heavy oilcloth wrapping. He pulled the bundle from the hidden recess, wiping away the damp earth to reveal an old field ledger from July 1975, the exact month of the editorial dispute described in the microfilm records Evelyn Finch had shown him. He brought the ledger up to the desk, his fingers trembling as he slid the brittle paper pages open under the flashlight beam, realizing that this document was a direct witness to the family truth that had been buried for half a century. The entry for July 21, 1975, was written in Harlan's sharp cursive script, but the ink was smudged with dried teardrops, the text capturing a moment of profound emotional intensity. Thomas came to the Ridge tonight with the corporate papers from Portland. He didn't look at the rain charts I had compiled. He only looked at the bank shares Marcus had promised him if the timber contracts cleared the valley titles. When I refused to sign the voluntary boundary adjustment, Thomas told me that he had already paid the county medical board to certify that my manual observations were the result of a degenerative senile psychosis. My own brother stood in this room and told me that if I ever spoke the name of the St. Jude Immigrant Cemetery to the federal land registrar, he would have me locked in the state hospital in Augusta until I forgot my own name. I locked the charts in the green cabinet tonight, not to hide from the truth, but to keep them from being burned before Arthur grows up. I'm leaving the key tag for locker 09 with Ben Miller. If anyone from my blood ever returns with an honest eye for the lines, they must know that I didn't abandon them. I stayed on this mountain to keep the earth from being forgotten. The document was an ironclad clue, a voice from the past that validated everything Arthur had suspected, but it was accompanied by a terrifying new unanswered question that made his blood run cold in the freezing room. The entry explicitly stated that Harlan had left the key tag for locker 09 with Ben Miller 44 years ago. Yet Ben had told Arthur that he only received a cloth sleeve of coordinates from Harlan before he died, and the key tag itself had actually arrived in the rural mailbox via a fresh postmark just yesterday, stripped of its key by physical force. If Ben Miller didn't have the tag all these years, who had secretly kept that empty surveyor's key tag since the surveyor's office was cleared out in 1974, and who had deliberately mailed it to the dead meteorologist's house the exact week Arthur Vance arrived on the ridge? Arthur leaned over the desk, his mind spinning as he looked at the 2024 resort map, his analytical eye catching a tiny, recurring geometric symbol printed along the margins of the digital plot sheets. A small, stylized emblem of a soaring hawk that served as the official logo of the Regional Development Trust. He realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the hawk logo was an exact match for the corporate emblem stamped on the heavy-duty logging glove the intruder had left behind in the yard during his first night on the mountain. The real-world conflict wasn't just approaching the weather station. The adversaries were already operating inside his perimeter, tracking his investigations with a meticulous efficiency that suggested they knew exactly what was hidden inside the cellar before he even pried open the rusted lock. Just as the realization settled into his chest, a loud, explosive smash shattered the silence of the porch outside, followed by the terrifying sound of heavy timber splintering as someone violently swung an axe against the wooden gateposts at the base of his driveway. Arthur ran to the window, pulling back the edge of the plywood patch just in time to see three shadowy figures dressed in dark, heavy oilskin slickers stepping out of an unmarked black utility truck, their faces obscured by low-brimmed caps as they began to methodically smash the external thermometer housings and the glass rain gauges with iron pry bars. One of the men stopped, turning his head directly toward the dock window where Arthur stood, and hoisted a heavy 5-gallon metal jerry can of industrial fuel onto his shoulder. The bright yellow halogen headlights of their truck illuminating a fresh, handwritten note that the man deliberately impaled onto the jagged iron remains of the broken gatepost, the bold red letters glistening in the freezing rain like a fresh wound. The lawsuit is closed. Vance, count your days before the match strikes. The exhaust notes of the unmarked utility truck faded into the rhythmic, icy lash of the storm, leaving Arthur Vance standing behind the boarded-up window of the instrument room, his chest heaving with a cold, protective rage that completely supplanted his previous despair. The smoke from the newly restarted kerosene heater swirled around his boots, but his focus was locked on the yard outside, where the external glass rain gauges and wooden Stevenson screens lay shattered into kindling by Marcus's hired vandals. He didn't run. Instead, a profound wave of renewed courage took root in his marrow, transforming his technical, analytical mind from that of a defeated corporate victim into a defensive tactician determined to preserve his grandfather's legacy. He stepped out onto the porch into the freezing needles of rain to retrieve the threatening note impaled on the broken gatepost, his gauze-wrapped hands stinging as he ripped the paper from the wood, staring at the bold red ink before stuffing it into his canvas coat pocket. The immediate practical challenge of the storm pressed in as the wind shifted, driving freezing sleet directly through the gaps in the wood siding, threatening to drop the internal temperature of the station and ruin the delicate, linen-backed maps indexed on the desk. Arthur hauled 3 heavy iron milk crates filled with old meteorological logs to block the drafty base of the door, his muscles screaming in protest as he calculated the thermal decay of the stone structure. Just as he wedged the final crate into place, the blinding sweep of approaching headlights cut through the dense sea fog, reflecting off the icy gravel of the driveway with a slow, cautious trajectory that didn't match the predatory speed of Marcus's truck. Arthur gripped the steel wrecking bar, his jaw set. But as the vehicle, a battered local town taxi, came to a halt, the passenger door swung open, and a young woman stepped out into the freezing downpour, hauling a heavy canvas backpack over her shoulder. It was his 21-year-old daughter, Clara, her face pale beneath her damp knit cap, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of anger, fear, and an undeniable, stubborn determination that she had clearly inherited from the Vance bloodline. Arthur dropped the iron bar, slamming the oak door open as he rushed out into the freezing rain to grab her backpack, pulling her inside the shelter of the stone house as the taxi quickly turned and retreated down the mountain road. The relationship scene unfolded with an intense, raw emotional vulnerability in the flickering blue light of the kerosene burner as Clara stood shivering in the center of the room, her eyes taking in the broken glass, the mud-stained floorboards, and the sheer physical ruin of her father's existence. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with an emotional weight that made Arthur's throat tighten with a sudden, suffocating grief. "Mom told me you were losing your mind up here, that you were hiding in a derelict shack because you couldn't face the bankruptcy lawyers in Portland. But I knew she was wrong." "I looked at the logistics spreadsheets you left on the home computer. Dad, I saw how the freight lanes were systematically strangled from the inside by Marcus's holding firms. You didn't fail us. They broke you on purpose to get you out of the way." Arthur closed his eyes, a tear slipping through the soot on his cheek as he pulled his daughter into a tight, fierce embrace, the gauze on his hands scratching against her damp jacket as he felt the profound healing of her validation. "I am so sorry, Clara," he choked out, his voice dropping to a raspy whisper as he apologized for the collapse of her college fund and the loss of their family home. "I spent 20 years calculating risks, and I never saw the threat inside our own family." Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes with a wet sleeve, her expression hardening into a defiant courage that mirrored his own. "We don't have time for regrets, Dad. I didn't come all the way from Oregon just to watch you surrender to a corrupt zoning board. Look what I brought." She unzipped her heavy backpack and pulled out a cracked, leather-bound book with a tarnished brass clasp, the personal field journal of Harlan Vance from 1982, which she had discovered hidden inside an old cedar chest in their Portland attic. This served as the primary mystery object of the chapter, moving the velocity firmly to 70% as Arthur placed it on the desk alongside the zinc box and the empty key tag for locker 09. The practical challenge of keeping his daughter from developing hypothermia forced Arthur to focus on the immediate environment. The kerosene heater was beginning to sputter again, its fuel reserves running dangerously low. Arthur took the rusted wood splitter's axe from the hearth and stepped out to the freezing woodshed, using his blistered, aching hands to methodically split thick logs of frozen pine, the physical exertion driving the remaining cold from his limbs as Clara stood in the doorway holding the flashlight for him. They brought the fresh timber inside, stoking the old stone hearth until a massive, roaring fire erupted across the gray ash heap, casting a deep, golden warmth that pushed the shadows back to the edges of the room. Sitting cross-references on the floorboards by the fire, they began to systematically decode the faded cursive entries in Harlan's 1982 journal, their minds working in a collaborative harmony that beautifully restored their broken relationship. The journal entries detailed the final desperate months before the Valley Timber Mill was forced to shut down, capturing the hidden history of a forgotten community with a heartbreaking emotional scale. Harlan had recorded how Marcus Vance had systematically used automated digital survey instruments to alter the baseline elevations of the valley floor, creating a legal illusion that the historic street Jude Immigrant Cemetery was located within a seasonal floodway, thereby rendering the public sanctuary legally unfit for preservation under state development codes. But as Clara turned to the entry for September 18, 1982, her finger stopped over a detailed drafting sketch of an ancient, massive tree marked with a distinctive, deep lightning scar along its eastern trunk. Harlan had labeled the tree as the Witness Oak, a centuries-old white oak that served as the primary, uncorrupted physical benchmark for the original 1888 municipal land grant. The text below the sketch served as an ironclad clue, providing the exact geographic coordinates of the tree relative to the weather station's anemometer tower. Harlan had written, "Marcus can corrupt the digital database at the county office, but he cannot erase the roots of the Witness Oak. The tree stands exactly 40 yards west of the secondary rain gauge line, beneath its subterranean root structure, inside a lead-lined dispatch box. I have buried the original, wax-sealed 1888 land grant deed containing the handwritten signatures of the colony founders. If Arthur ever returns to this mountain, he must use the manual chain links to trace the baseline from the tower to the oak. The physical deed is the only shield that will shatter Marcus's digital fraud at the public hearing." The discovery left Arthur leaning over the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs as the pieces of the historical puzzle fell into a definitive alignment. But it immediately raised a chilling, critical unanswered question that hung in the warm air of the room. The entry explicitly stated that Harlan had buried the original 1888 deed to keep it from being burned by Arthur's father and uncle. Yet the journal itself had been left in a common storage box in the Portland attic all these years, entirely accessible to his father Thomas before his death. Why had his father kept this specific journal intact, allowing his granddaughter Clara to find it decades later, instead of destroying the coordinates to protect the corporate empire he had built with Marcus? The real-world conflict was converging on the ridge with a terrifying velocity. Arthur knew that the 48-hour eviction notice was ticking away, and Marcus's line crews would arrive by Thursday noon to demolish the station. He looked at Clara. His face hardened with an absolute, unshakable purpose as he grabbed the industrial flashlight and the surveyor's chain links from the equipment locker. "We have to find that tree tonight, Clara," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a deep, ancestral courage as the wind howled against the stone exterior. Before they strike the match, the rattle of the heavy surveyor's chain links against the damp pine floorboards of the instrument room sounded like a handful of old coins being dropped into a vault. A cold, metallic rhythm that seemed to steady Arthur Vance's breathing as the horizontal freezing rain continued to lash the fieldstone exterior of the Blackwood Ridge station. He knelt beside the open equipment locker, his gauze-wrapped hands moving with a deliberate, programmatic efficiency that had dormant for the 3 months since Vance Global Logistics had been stripped down to bare ledger lines by the bankruptcy court in Portland. He checked the links for rust, sliding his thumb over the stamped brass tolerance tags, CCC, Survey Unit, 1934. Feeling his analytical focus sharpening around a singular, definitive baseline. He wasn't looking at corporate distribution lanes or automated shipping metrics anymore. He was tracing the physical geometry of an ancestral sacrifice. And for the first time since his midlife collapse, the hollow ache of redundancy in his chest was replaced by an absolute, driving sense of purpose. Clara stood beside him, her heavy canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, her fingers gripping the leather-bound 1982 journal they had just decoded by the dying golden warmth of the stone hearth. Her young face was pale from the biting mountain cold, but her dark eyes carried an unyielding determination that made Arthur realize how much of his grandfather's unbending steel had bypassed his own father to take root directly in his daughter. He looked up at her, his logistics brain automatically calculating the physical load of the trek they were about to make into the dark. freezing timber lines west of the station. "Before we step out into that slush, Clara, you need to understand something," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a raspy, solemn register that filled the quiet room with an intense emotional vulnerability. "Your grandfather Harlan didn't leave these coordinates behind because he wanted us to play detective. He left them because he knew that the system Marcus built would eventually run out of digital lies and have to face the physical dirt. I spent 20 years believing that my spreadsheets were a shield for you and your mother, that as long as the capital velocity looked correct on a monitor, we were safe from the margins. But the margins are real. Clara, they're sitting out there in that forest, and if we don't locate that original benchmark tonight, Marcus will use that 48-hour summary eviction notice to board up this ridge and turn your great-grandfather's life into a corporate footnote." Clara knelt down into the soot-dusted floorboards beside him, her hand coming down onto his scarred wrist, her grip firm and warm despite the freezing drafts leaking through the cedar siding. "I'm not looking at the spreadsheets anymore, Dad," she said softly, her voice carrying a deep, maternal validation that made his throat tighten with a sudden, suffocating wave of healing. "I'm looking at you. You didn't run away from us when the company collapsed. You just came to the only place that was still honest enough to hold you." Now let's go find his lines. This raw emotional reconciliation served as the definitive anchor for their collaborative effort as Arthur slung the heavy iron survey chain over his shoulder, grabbed the industrial steel flashlight and a heavy-duty iron trench spade from the porch utility box, and led Clara out into the blinding, freezing downpour of the autumn gale. The transition into the immediate practical challenge was instantaneous. The moment they stepped beyond the shelter of the stone porch, the North Atlantic wind slammed into their chests like a physical wall of gray ice, threatening to freeze the moisture on their clothes within minutes. The ground was a treacherous, shifting matrix of saturated mud, rotting pine needles, and glassy sheets of black ice that had coated the access ruts left by Marcus's utility truck. Arthur set their primary datum point at the concrete base of the external anemometer mast, hooking the lead ring of the surveyor's chain into the rusty anchor bolt his grandfather had poured in 1934. He handed the flashlight to Clara, instructing her to keep the beam level along the western sight line, while he began to methodically uncoil the heavy iron links into the dark timber brush, his boots sinking 6 inches into the freezing mire with every step. The physical exertion was brutal. His blistered palms screamed in agony as the coarse, oiled metal links bit through the cotton gauze, reopening the raw scrape on his thumb and leaving a dark trail of blood along the frozen iron links. But he refused to slow down, his logical mind translating the coordinates from Harlan's journal into an exact physical trajectory. 40 yards due west of the secondary rain gauge line, the ledger had dictated. Arthur counted the standard 10-chain increments, his breath pluming like white smoke in the gray fog, as he navigated the dense, overlapping branches of old-growth spruce that fought against his forward progress like a line of silent sentinels. The storm seemed to intensify around them, the horizontal sleet stinging their faces and turning the forest into a chaotic, roaring void. But Arthur's spatial coordination remained locked onto the baseline calculation, his logistics training allowing him to map the invisible terrain with a flawless, human-scale precision. After 40 minutes of agonizing physical struggle through the freezing underbrush, the iron chain pulled taut against the anemometer mast anchor behind them, and Arthur stopped, his flashlight beam cutting through a dense curtain of gray sea fog to reveal a massive, ancient silhouette rising from the edge of the municipal forest boundary. It was the witness oak. The tree was a colossal, primeval white oak, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its gnarled branches stretching out into the freezing dark like the ribs of an old privateer vessel. even in the blinding sleet. The primary identifying clue was unmistakable. A deep, jagged, corkscrewed scar from a historic lightning strike ran vertically down the eastern side of the trunk, splitting the ancient bark into a pale silver channel that perfectly matched the drafting sketch Clara had discovered in the 1982 journal. Arthur dropped to his knees at the base of the massive trunk, his chest heaving as the physical victory of locating the benchmark brought a sudden overwhelming surge of ancestral energy into his frozen limbs. He cleared away the thick layer of rotting oak leaves and freezing slush with his gloved hands, exposing the rough, rocky New England soil beneath the root line. The next phase of the practical challenge required an immense, sustained physical labor. The ground was partially frozen by the autumn freeze, the soil a dense, unyielding matrix of packed clay, granite river stones, and thick, interlocking oak roots that resisted the iron blade of the trench spade. Arthur drove the shovel into the earth with his boot, the metal clinking sharply against a hidden stone, sending a jarring vibration up through his arms that rattled his teeth. Clara stepped into the mud beside him, grabbing the handle of the old wood-splitter's axe to carefully notch away the smaller, superficial root runners that blocked the spade's path. Their movements synchronized in a quiet, tireless rhythm of shared labor. Sweat mixed with the freezing rain on Arthur's forehead, his muscles burning with a deep, systemic fatigue. But every strike of the shovel felt like an act of pure emotional reclamation. He wasn't digging a hole in the mud, he was digging his way out of the corporate bankruptcy that had defined him as a failure. Stripping away the lies of his brother and father to reach the uncorrupted bedrock of his family history. 2 feet down into the freezing earth, near the primary taproot on the eastern sightline, the iron edge of Arthur's spade struck something flat, rigid, and unmistakably structural with a heavy, muffled thud that echoed through the hollow base of the tree. Arthur froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as he dropped the shovel and fell to his knees. Using his bare, gauzed fingers to frantically clear the remaining mud from the cavity, emerging from the dark clay like a buried treasure from an older, more honest world, was a heavy rectangular container made of solid, lead-lined zinc. Its exterior wrapped in a coarse, rotted layer of vintage military canvas that had preserved the metal from the moisture of the watershed for 44 years. This was the primary mystery object of their long hunt, and as Arthur hoisted the heavy container out of the mud onto a flat granite stone, the mystery velocity reached 80%. The physical proof of Harlan's legacy finally resting in his hands. He used the tip of the crowbar to pry open the heavy, corroded latches of the zinc box, the metal seals groaning before snapping open with a sharp click to reveal the contents inside. Protected within a secondary lining of oil-treated linen was a single, legal-size parchment document, its edges pristine and white, entirely untouched by the rot of the valley. It was the original, uncorrupted 1888 municipal land grant deed for the Oak Haven Township, its surface bearing the elegant, handwritten boundary descriptions executed by the colony founders, and sealed at the bottom with 3 massive intact seals of crimson beeswax. Arthur unrolled the document under the beam of Clara's flashlight, his eyes scanning the elegant copperplate script as his logistics mind instantly verified the legal parameters. The deed explicitly stated that the entire Blackwood Ridge line, the Whispering Pines Basin, and the historic street, Jude Immigrant Cemetery, were legally designated as a protected, non-transferable municipal watershed reserve in perpetuity, an ironclad public trust that could never be liquidated or transferred to private developers by any zoning board or automated registry office. The signatures at the baseline of the grant were crisp and bold, but as Arthur reached the historical addendum sheet attached to the back of the deed, His eyes locked onto a small, handwritten notation from July 1975 that served as the primary clue of their discovery. His grandfather Harlan had penned an official federal land registrar receipt to the grant, proving that this physical document was the singular, legal primary copy of the Valley title, and that any digital database or computerized survey that contradicted these boundaries was a class federal forgery. The discovery was total, providing the definitive weapon Arthur needed to destroy Marcus's resort project at the emergency hearing. But as he turned the parchment over to close the lead container, his technical eye caught a final, terrifying paragraph printed in fine print along the lower legal margin that dropped a chilling new unanswered question into the freezing air of the forest. The 1888 grant carried a strict, explicit statutory execution clause stating that for an original physical deed to override a modern digital title in a regional land court during an emergency abatement dispute, the document had to be formally presented in person by a certified municipal custodian or a direct linear heir to the district court judge in Machias no later than 24 hours prior to the pre-approved demolition time. Arthur's blood turned to ice as he cross-referenced the statutory timeline with the summary eviction notice Sheriff Cole had delivered. Marcus's demolition crews were scheduled to strike the match at Thursday noon, which meant Arthur had to physically deliver this wax-sealed deed to the county judge's bench by Wednesday noon at the absolute latest. He checked his dead phone, then looked up through the dark trees toward the high peak of the ridge where the mountain access road sat completely blocked by the boulder barricades and hired lookouts Marcus had established to isolate him. The real-world conflict was narrowing into a desperate, human-scale race against time. He had the ironclad proof to save the valley and regain his family dignity, but he was currently a bankrupt, evicted pariah trapped on top of a freezing mountain in a blinding ice storm with less than 36 hours left to cross 50 miles of wilderness on foot. How could an outcast with no capital, no vehicle transmission, and no legal standing cross Marcus's blockade to deliver the voice of the ridge before the clock ran out? Arthur looked at Clara, his face hardened with an absolute, unshakable acceptance of the trial ahead. As a sudden, distant rumble of heavy machinery echoed from the access trail below. The twin yellow halogen beams of an unmarked utility vehicle slowly beginning to ascend the mountain toward the dark stone station once more. The raw hum of the unmarked utility vehicle's engine growled through the frozen branches of the forest, its dual halogen beams casting elongated, skeletal shadows of the spruce trees across the snow-dusted clearing of the witness oak. Arthur Vance crouched behind a low outcropping of glacial granite, his arm wrapped firmly around Clara's shoulder, holding his breath as the freezing mud soaked through the knees of his jeans. His gauze-wrapped palms, stained with black soot from the zinc container and raw blood from the iron surveyor's chains, throbbed with a rhythmic agony that seemed to ground his frantic thoughts into a singular, unshakable matrix of strategic logistics. He held the heavy, lead-lined zinc box against his chest like an absolute lifeline, his mind automatically auditing the terrifying statutory clause they had just uncovered on the baseline margin of the 1888 land grant deed. The system his father and uncle had corrupted 50 years ago didn't just automate lines on a server. It possessed a legal execution deadline that was ticking away with a cold, mechanical velocity. For the original physical parchment to override Marcus's digital title fraud at the public council, Arthur had to present the wax-sealed grant in person to the district court judge in Machias by Wednesday noon, exactly 19 hours from this very moment. If he failed to cross the 50 miles of coastal wilderness before the clock ran out, the summary abatement order would take effect. The line crews would level the stone weather station at Thursday noon, and the historic St. Jude Immigrant Cemetery would be permanently buried beneath a corporate golf course. He looked down at Clara, her breath pluming like pale gray smoke in the beam of the flashlight she held low against the mud. The emotional arc of the night had brought him to a state of deep, absolute acceptance. He was no longer mourning the bankruptcy of his Portland firm or running from the hollow shadow of his failed marriage. He looked at the lightning scar running down the ancient oak trunk, realizing that he was the direct, linear heir to a multi-decade sacrifice of pure human decency. His grandfather Harlan had endured 40 years of forced isolation and familial slander on this ridge just to keep this physical parchment from being burned. And Arthur accepted the weight of that inheritance with a quiet, ancestral pride that restored his masculine dignity far more than any corporate profit margin ever could. The immediate practical challenge of their survival forced its way through his reflection when the utility vehicle stopped at the secondary rain gauge line 40 yards away, its heavy doors slamming open as two men stepped into the freezing sleet, their iron pry bars clinking against the rocks as they began to systematically scan the underbrush with high-powered searchlights. Arthur knew that trying to return to his sputtering Ford Escape was an operational impossibility. The vehicle's worn transmission would never clear the boulder barricades Marcus had established at the base of the mountain road, and the lookouts would intercept them before they reached the state highway. He leaned close to Clara's ear, his voice dropping to a raspy, decisive whisper that carried the calm authority of his old supply chain training. Clara, you need to take the old logging trail through the eastern ravine, down to Evelyn Finch's house in the village, he instructed, his eyes locked onto her face with an intense emotional vulnerability. Marcus's men are focused entirely on the western slope and the main driveway. Take Harlan's 1982 journal with you. If I don't clear the blockade on the road, you and Evelyn must get that journal to Sheriff Cole before the town hall opens on Thursday morning. Let him see the handwritten names of the families Harlan saved. Clara gripped the sleeve of his canvas coat, her fingers shaking from the cold, but her brown eyes flashing with that stubborn, unyielding Vance steel. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking with a fierce, protective love that made Arthur's chest tighten with a sudden, overwhelming wave of healing. We just found each other in this mud. I'm not letting them take you back to Portland in handcuffs. Arthur squeezed her hand, a soft smile breaking through the grime on his face as he delivered a maternal validation that anchored her courage. They aren't taking me anywhere, sweetheart. I spent 25 years optimizing routes for international carriers. I know exactly how to use a bottleneck when the terrain is crowded. The sea fog is rolling off the Atlantic right now, and by midnight, the visibility on the ridge will drop to less than 3 feet. Marcus's men have automated digital mapping systems, but they don't know how the wind moves through these rocks. Your great-grandfather spent 40 years logging the fog flow lines on this mountain, and he left me the exact chart to walk through it. Go to Evelyn. Clara, keep the record safe. This emotional reconciliation gave Clara the strength to nod. Slipping the leather-bound journal into her heavy canvas backpack before fading silently into the dense, dark spruce underbrush of the eastern ravine like a phantom. Left alone in the freezing mud, Arthur waited until the lookout's searchlight beams swept away from his outcropping, then began his own perilous maneuver, transitioning into the immediate practical challenge of navigating a treacherous mountain trail in a blinding horizontal sleet storm. He unrolled Harlan's 1979 fog flow map under the pale glow of his flashlight, his analytical eye tracking the faint, hand-drawn sepia arrows that indicated the seasonal atmospheric currents of Blackwood Ridge. His grandfather had documented that during an October nor'easter, the low-pressure cell over the bay drove a dense, heavy blanket of salt fog directly up the western granite cliffs, creating an absolute blind spot along an old, abandoned civilian conservation corps foot trail that descended the steep southern face of the mountain. The trail was a vertical nightmare of loose scree, wet moss, and jagged ledge drops that had been closed to the public since the 1950s. But it was the only route that completely bypassed Marcus's road blockade. Arthur secured the zinc box inside his canvas jacket, tying the old hemp safety line tightly around his waist, and stepped off the granite ledge directly into the swirling vortex of the gray sea fog. The visibility vanished instantly, the world reduced to a suffocating, freezing void where he could barely see his own boots. Every step was an agony of physical calculation. The granite path was coated in a glassy, mirror-like shell of black ice, and his blistered hands screamed in protest as he slithered down the sheer rock faces, his fingers groping for the gnarled roots of the mountain cedar trees to arrest his slides. He slipped twice, his boots losing purchase on the wet slate, his body slamming heavily against the rock shelf, knocking the breath from his lungs and sending a shower of loose gravel plunging into the invisible abyss below. He lay gasping against the freezing stone, the cold mud caking his face. But as he touched the rigid outline of the zinc box against his ribs, a profound sense of acceptance filled his mind. He wasn't a victim of market forces or a redundant city manager anymore. He was the voice of the ridge, and the earth beneath his bleeding fingers was guiding his descent with a flawless, historical geometry. He cross-referenced the terrain with his memory of Harlan's 1979 chart, identifying a narrow, natural chimney in the granite face where the wind velocity dropped to 0, allowing him to slide down the final 15 feet of the cliff onto the soft, needle-strewn floor of the lower valley basin. Panting heavily, his muscles shaking with a deep systemic fatigue, Arthur unhitched the hemp rope and checked his bearings. The dense sea fog had followed him down the mountain, blanketing the entire old-growth forest in a thick, silent shroud that muffled the distant roar of the coastal highway. He checked the zinc box. The lead lining had kept the document perfectly dry, the wax seals intact. He walked forward through the dark woods, his analytical eye tracking the historic stone walls that marked the true, uncorrupted boundary lines of the town, until he reached the overgrown clearing of the old public access road. The mystery progression was entering its final, absolute phase. At 90% velocity, the baseline truth was resting in his hands. But the real-world conflict was about to converge on the steps of civilization. As Arthur stepped onto the asphalt lane near the edge of the municipal forest, a pair of brilliant halogen headlights erupted through the fog 20 yards away, accompanied by the sharp, terrifying shriek of spinning tires as an unmarked black utility truck skated across the wet ice, its massive steel grill guard coming to a halt inches from his chest. The driver's door slammed open, and two muscular men dressed in dark corporate security jackets stepped into the freezing sleet. Their faces hardened with a cold, professional ruthlessness that carried no hesitation. "Marcus wants the lead box, Vance," the taller man said, his voice flat as he drew a heavy iron tire iron from his belt. His eyes locked onto the bulge inside Arthur's canvas jacket. "He said if you're stubborn like your old man, we're supposed to leave you in the mud with the rest of the forgotten names." Arthur didn't retreat. He stood his ground on the asphalt, his posture straight and his heart calm as a sudden, familiar sound broke through the roaring wind. The clanking of heavy tire chains and the high-pitched wail of a county siren as Sheriff Cole's cruiser emerged from the sea fog, its red and blue lights reflecting off the wet trees with a brilliant, blinding intensity. Cole slammed his vehicle into park, stepping out into the sleet with his service weapon drawn.
His craggy face set in an iron mask of local authority that instantly froze the corporate henchmen in their tracks. This ran directly into a powerful relationship scene, as Cole marched over to Arthur, his sharp gray eyes taking in the blood on his hands, the mud on his face, and the zinc container pinned beneath his arm. "Clara made it down to Evelyn's house 10 minutes ago, Arthur," Cole said, his deep New England drawl carrying a profound, quiet validation that made Arthur's throat tighten with an unexpected wave of relief. "She showed me the 1982 ledger sheets. I just spent the last hour auditing the digital database logs at the station, and the county server shows that Marcus's line crews didn't file an automated utility disconnect order. They manually bypassed the regional network lines to fake the data. I've got a state trooper unit heading to Marcus's house in Machias right now, but we've got a bigger bottleneck. Son, Marcus just filed an emergency motion at the Oak Haven Town Hall to accelerate the land sale meeting to tonight, claiming that the weather station's structural collapse constitutes an immediate threat to public safety. The council is sitting in the main chamber right now, and the mayor is preparing to call the vote. If they sign that title transfer before we present this physical deed, Marcus will have the legal authority to clear the ridge by morning, and no regional judge can undo a municipal vote after the contract is sealed." The revelation hit Arthur with an intense, suffocating urgency. The adversaries hadn't surrendered. They had moved the goalposts to execute their final, desperate play before he could reach the judicial bench in Machias. The real-world conflict was no longer a race across 50 miles of wilderness. It was a localized, human-scale confrontation occurring right now on the steps of the Oak Haven Town Hall. Arthur looked at Sheriff Cole, his face hardened with an absolute, unshakable purpose as he stepped toward the passenger side of the cruiser. "Then turn on the sirens, Cole," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a deep ancestral courage that filled the damp cabin as they slammed the doors shut. "We're going to give the council their audit." The vehicle roared forward through the blinding sea fog, its tires' chains clawing the wet asphalt as they descended into the valley. But as Arthur looked down at the wax-sealed parchment inside his jacket, a chilling new unanswered question began to wrap itself around his thoughts. The 1975 field ledger had explicitly stated that his father, Thomas Vance, had paid the county medical board to falsify the senile psychosis papers to silence Harlan. Yet the original 1888 deed had been meticulously preserved within a lead-lined zinc box that was explicitly marked with a modern corporate inventory code matching his father's Portland shipping lane registers. If his father had spent 40 years helping Marcus bury the watershed fraud to protect the family business, why had he personally used his own corporate logistics network to secretly encase and shield the original uncorrupted deed beneath the roots of the witness oak, effectively providing his bankrupt son with the ultimate weapon to destroy his own brother's empire half a century later? The cruiser rounded the final curve of the tidal basin, its headlights illuminating the crowded brick facade of the Oak Haven Town Hall through the swirling mist, where the bright yellow halogen lights of Marcus's utility trucks were already idling along the curb, their heavy diesel engines purring like a line of executioners waiting for the match to strike. The tires of Sheriff Cole's cruiser screeched as they slammed against the slush-covered curb in front of the Oak Haven Town Hall, the heavy tire chains clanking violently against the asphalt like a broken machine trying to re-engage its gears. Arthur Vance stepped out into the freezing horizontal sleet, pinning the heavy lead-lined zinc box tightly against his ribs beneath his soaked canvas jacket, his heart hammering with a steady, calculated rhythm that felt entirely different from the panic of his corporate bankruptcy in Portland. He was no longer running from debt collectors or mourning his technical redundancy. As he looked up at the arched colonial brick facade of the municipal building,
he felt a profound, heavy sense of belonging settling into his chest. Recognizing that his entire 25-year career in logistics management had been nothing but a long, grueling training arc designed to prepare him for this singular, human-scale audit. Inside the building, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, cheap floor wax, and the electric hum of baseboard heaters, a stark contrast to the clean, silent isolation of Blackwood Ridge. Arthur walked down the central corridor, his boots leaving a trail of muddy water on the linoleum, flanked by Sheriff Cole, whose hand rested firmly on his service belt as they approached the frosted glass doors of the main council chamber. Through the glass, Arthur could hear the muffled, aggressive baritone of his uncle Marcus Vance, who was currently reading from a digital tablet, his voice amplified by the room's ancient public address system. Arthur pushed the heavy doors open, the brass handles clicking sharply as he entered the crowded wood-paneled room, causing a sudden dead silence to ripple across the rows of benches where nearly 80 local residents had gathered for the emergency hearing. The townspeople, weathered lobstermen, retired timber workers, and local business owners turned their heads in unison, their eyes locking onto Arthur's ragged silhouette, taking in his soot-stained face, his gauze-wrapped hands, and the unmistakable, unyielding steel in his gaze that mirrored the late Harlan Vance. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his fingers freezing over the glass screen of his tablet, his superficial warmth instantly evaporating into a pale, tight mask of predatory calculation as he stared at the zinc box beneath his nephew's arm. The immediate practical challenge of the confrontation presented itself before Arthur could even reach the central presentation table. Marcus's corporate attorney, a sharp-faced man from the Southern District dressed in an immaculate gray suit, stood up from the council desk, waving a thick leather folio of automated title registries as he issued a loud, formal procedural objection to the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, this is a closed municipal land allocation hearing, and this individual is currently subject to a summary emergency abatement and eviction order issued by the county magistrate," the attorney declared, his voice carrying the cold, sterile authority of a contract clause. "He has no legal standing to interrupt these proceedings, nor does he possess any certified digital survey data recognized by the state land registry system. Any physical documents he intends to present are completely non-existent under modern administrative codes." The mayor, a tired-looking man named Henderson, who had spent 30 years watching the town's tax base slowly dry up, looked toward Sheriff Cole, his hand hovering over his wooden gavel in a moment of agonizing bureaucratic hesitation. Arthur didn't wait for a ruling. He stepped directly past the attorney, his boots clopping loudly against the hardwood floor as he unzipped his canvas jacket and lifted the heavy, lead-lined zinc container, slamming it down onto the center of the oak council table with a resounding, hollow thud that echoed off the cedar rafters. This ran directly into a powerful relationship scene, as Clara stepped forward from the back row of the gallery, her heavy canvas backpack slung over her shoulder, walking down the central aisle to stand rigidly beside her father. She reached into her bag and placed Harlan's leather-bound 1982 field journal directly next to the zinc container, her brown eyes flashing with a defiant, generational pride that beautifully validated Arthur's struggle. Evelyn Finch, the town archivist, followed her, carrying a massive leather-bound volume of original colony land charters from 1974, her sharp blue eyes locked onto Marcus with an unblinking historical judgment that made the older developer shift his weight uneasily against the podium. Arthur looked at his daughter, seeing the complete absence of the quiet disappointment that had haunted her eyes since the college fund collapsed, and he felt a deep, systemic healing wash through his chest. Realizing that by standing in this room to defend the mountain, He had finally restored his standing as a father. He turned to face the rows of townspeople, his voice clear, steady, and carrying the absolute resonant authority of a man who had spent his life calculating baseline truths. I am here as the direct, linear heir of Harlan Vance, the certified regional land steward of Blackwood Ridge, Arthur announced, his words cutting through the electrical hum of the chamber. My uncle Marcus has told this council that the weather station is an obsolete pile of rocks, a useless white elephant that must be demolished to clear the title for a regional resort contract. He has presented automated digital surveys showing that the western slope is vacant public land, legally clear for commercial liquidation. But I am here to tell you that the digital system you have trusted for 40 years is a calculated lie. An automated screen designed to hide a systemic theft of this community's heritage. He used his gauze-wrapped fingers to pry open the heavy, corroded latches of the zinc box, the metal seals snapping open with a sharp click that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. He carefully pulled the pristine, linen-backed 1888 land grant deed from its oilcloth sleeve, unrolling the massive parchment sheet across the oak table, pinning the corners down with the modified brass barometer and his grandfather's manual survey links. Marcus stepped forward from the podium, his face dark with fury as he tried to lean over the table to obscure the writing. "This is nothing but old paper, Arthur," Marcus snarled, his voice losing its smooth corporate veneer and revealing the raw, ugly desperation of a cornered land speculator. "The county digitized the valley lines 40 years ago. A physical description from the 19th century holds no legal weight against a certified electronic title validated by the state registrar." Arthur looked at his uncle, his logistics mind instantly identifying the precise mechanical flaw in Marcus's argument. "It holds weight when the digital database is a direct product of fraud, Marcus," Arthur said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, clear whisper. He pointed his finger to the elegant copperplate script along the baseline of the 1888 deed, where the crimson cross-hatching of the Whispering Pines watershed was defined by 3 historic stone markers. "This is the original, wax-sealed municipal grant for the Oak Haven Township. It has been hidden beneath the roots of the witness oak since September of 1982, because my grandfather knew you would try to burn the records. This document explicitly states that the entire Blackwood Ridge line and the western slope are a protected, non-transferable public watershed trust in perpetuity. It can never be sold, liquidated, or transferred to private developers by any municipal vote or zoning board. And more importantly, the shifted coordinates you digitized in 1974 precisely cut through a forgotten 3-acre parcel located at the base of the ridge, the St. Jude Immigrant Cemetery and Schoolhouse plot. You didn't just alter lines on a server to steal timber, Marcus. You legally erased the graves of the stonemasons who built this very town hall, desecrating the history of 80 local families just to clear a clean title for a corporate golf course. A sudden collective gasp erupted from the benches behind him as Ben Miller, the retired timber worker, stood up in the third row, his weathered face trembling with a raw, ancestral fury as he stared at the hand-drawn map. "My great-grandfather is buried in that patch by the river. Marcus," Ben shouted, his rough voice shaking the wood paneling of the chamber. "You told my family in '82 that the drainage basin had expanded due to natural erosion, that the church had no legal claim to the plot. You lied to us for 40 years while we were starving." The room erupted into a chaotic roar of shouting voices as the townspeople surged forward against the wooden gallery rail, their shared grief and indignation transforming the sterile administrative meeting into a powerful arena of public accountability. Mayor Henderson began to beat his wooden gavel repeatedly against the desk, his face pale as he looked at the pristine, wax-sealed deed and the handwritten 1982 ledger sheets that Evelyn Finch was now systematically cross-referencing with the original 1974 colony charter stamp. The adversarial conflict was reaching its absolute climax. Marcus's attorney tried to grab the leather folder of contract specs to retreat from the table, but Sheriff Cole stepped forward, placing his heavy hand onto the lawyer's shoulder with a quiet, unyielding local authority that instantly froze him in place. Arthur stood calm in the center of the storm, his eyes locked onto Marcus, who had sunk back onto the podium bench, his silver hair disheveled and his unshakable confidence completely shattered by the physical weight of the evidence. Arthur looked at the maps, his technical eye catching a final, stunning micro-clue that had been hidden within the ink lines of the 1888 addendum sheet. A small, faded blue corporate shipping stamp from Vance Global Logistics, dated November 14, 1982. The exact date of his father's blackmail letter. He realized with a sudden, overwhelming emotional intensity that the final piece of the mystery was solved. His father, Thomas Vance, hadn't just been a cold co-conspirator in Marcus's fraud. After threatening to commit his own brother to an asylum to protect the family business, Thomas had been consumed by a secret, paralyzing guilt. He had used his own international logistics network to secretly encase, vacuum seal, and bury the original uncorrupted 1888 deed beneath the witness oak, intentionally creating an absolute, physical backup of the truth because he knew that Marcus's digital servers would eventually try to erase everything. Thomas had left the coordinates in the Portland attic box for his logistics-trained son, transforming Arthur's bankruptcy into a long-delayed path of generational redemption. The mystery arc was now 95% revealed, the baseline truth fully validated by the community. But as the shouting in the chamber subsided into a tense, expectant silence, Mayor Henderson cleared his throat, his hand resting on the ancient town charter as he looked at Arthur with a profound, quiet respect that carried a deep sense of true belonging. The council has reviewed the physical grant and the archival records presented by Ms. Finch, Henderson announced, his voice ringing through the quiet room as he struck his gavel once with a decisive, final crack. Under the statutory execution clauses of the 1888 Charter, this physical deed takes immediate, absolute precedence over any digital database registry. The emergency land sale to the Southern Development Trust is hereby canceled, and all corporate logging and construction permits on Blackwood Ridge are frozen in perpetuity. Marcus Vance's financial logs are impounded for a formal county audit under the supervision of Sheriff Coleman. However, this council faces a secondary, critical administrative bottleneck. Under the strict terms of the original 1888 grant, for the weather station's parcel to maintain its legal exemption from county tax forfeiture and remain a protected public watershed. The structure cannot sit vacant. It must have a legally certified resident, regional director and land steward physically living at the outpost to manually log the environmental metrics and maintain the physical boundary lines. The town's current budget cannot fund a modern digital observation array, and if we do not appoint a permanent custodian who possesses the certified technical capacity to audit the lanes by the 1st of November, the title will automatically lapse to the state administrative pool, and the ridge will be left vulnerable to a federal allocation override. The revelation dropped a chilling, unexpected, new, unanswered question into the warm air of the council chamber, instantly shifting the tension from a corporate battle to an existential trial of survival. Arthur stood at the table, his fingers still resting on the iron survey links. Realizing that the valley had been saved from Marcus's predation, but the ultimate future of his sanctuary remained balanced on a razor's edge. He checked his dead phone. then looked at Clara and the expectant faces of the townspeople who were waiting for his answer. Knowing that he had the logistics training to run the lanes, but he possessed no capital, no personal assets, and no official certification from the National Weather Service to operate an obsolete meteorological station. Just as he prepared to speak, a loud, heavy mechanical shudder vibrated through the floorboards of the town hall, followed by the terrifying, high-pitched shriek of an iron cable snapping outside in the dark plaza, as a massive regional power surge from the freezing rainstorm instantly blew the building's main transformers, plunging the entire council chamber into an absolute pitch-black darkness that swallowed the maps, the deed, and the faces of the community in a single, suffocating instant. The absolute, pitch-black darkness that swallowed the council chamber of the Oak Haven Town Hall felt like a physical weight, instantly freezing the breath in Arthur Vance's throat as the high-pitched shriek of the blown transformer echoed through the wet plaza outside. For a single, terrifying second, the vacuum of light threatened to pull him back into the paralyzing, hollow grief of his Portland bankruptcy. A sudden regression where everything he had fought to rebuild over the last 3 weeks seemed to vanish into air. But as he stood rigidly beside the oak council table, his gauze-wrapped hand didn't tremble. His fingers remained locked onto the coarse, linen edge of the 1888 land grant deed, his logical mind immediately switching from panic to a state of absolute, programmatic calculation. He was an expert in logistics who had spent 25 years optimizing disrupted supply lines under high structural loads. And he knew that darkness was not a systemic failure. It was simply a localized visibility bottleneck that could be managed with the correct deployment of resources. He reached into his canvas jacket pocket with his left hand, his skin raw and chapped from the freezing mountain sleet, and pulled out his industrial steel flashlight, sliding the thumb switch forward. The brilliant, focused beam sliced through the suffocating dark like a blade, illuminating the unrolled parchment deed, the crimson wax seals, and the hand-annotated brass barometer that rested over the Whispering Pines watershed boundaries. The sudden illumination ran directly into their final relationship scene as Clara reached out from the darkness, her cold fingers wrapping tightly around his wrist to help him steady the beam, her eyes shining with an unyielding, generational steel that beautifully validated his presence in the room. Evelyn Finch stepped closer, using her reading glasses to shield the fragile edges of the Colony Charter volume, while Sheriff Cole stood at the central aisle, his heavy mag light cast toward the benches where 80 local residents sat frozen in an expectant, breathless silence. Arthur looked at his daughter, seeing the complete transformation in her posture. The quiet resentment and anger that had bruised her features since the collapse of her college fund had entirely evaporated, replaced by a deep, unshakable pride in the father who had stood in the mud to trace their family's true lines. He felt a profound wave of emotional renewal wash through his chest, a total healing of the wound of redundancy that had consumed his midlife crisis. He wasn't a discarded city manager hiding from debt collectors anymore. He was the permanent custodian of the Ridge, and his voice carried the absolute weight of a restored dignity. This emotional rebirth anchored his focus as he addressed the immediate practical challenge of the darkness and the municipal bottleneck Mayor Henderson had just articulated. The town needed a certified resident director to live at the outpost to maintain its legal watershed status, and Arthur possessed no federal meteorology credentials or capital to fund the station's restoration. He turned his flashlight beam directly onto the podium where Marcus Vance sat huddled on the bench, his tailored cashmere coat covered in black cellar dust and his silver hair disheveled, the older man's predatory confidence completely broken by the physical evidence of his fraud. We don't need automated networks or county server grants to keep the ridge alive, Mayor Henderson, Arthur announced, his voice ringing through the darkened chamber with a clear, resonant authority that filled the wood-paneled room. My grandfather Harlan lived up there for 40 years with nothing but a mercury column, a manual rain bucket, and a ledger book. He didn't track the weather to predict the weekend forecast for tourists. He logged the rain to create an ironclad physical record of the earth, protecting the water that feeds this village from my uncle's corporate greed. I spent 25 years managing complex transport logistics, tracking the exact flow of resources through crowded channels. I know how to read the lanes, and I know how to preserve the boundaries. I am officially petitioning this council to appoint me as the permanent resident regional land steward and chief meteorologist of Blackwood Ridge. I don't ask for a municipal salary or a state stipend. I only ask for the right to live under that stone roof and keep the records pristine for the next generation. The announcement dropped into the chamber like a physical bass line, and for a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic lashing of the freezing rain against the tall window panes. Then, Ben Miller stood up from the front row of the gallery, his weathered face wet with tears as he turned to face the rows of townsfolk. Arthur's blood is the only thing that kept my family from being evicted in '82, Ben shouted, his rough timber worker's voice echoing off the cedar rafters. Harlan Vance froze on that mountain to keep our history from being erased, and his grandson just walked through a blinding ice storm to bring us the true deed. If the grant requires a custodian to live on the peak, Arthur is the only man who has the right to sign the book. The benches erupted into a thunderous wave of public validation, the local residents stomping their boots against the floorboards and clapping their calloused hands in a powerful, unified consensus that completely overrode the procedural objections of the corporate lawyers. Mayor Henderson looked at Evelyn Finch, who nodded with an ironclad historical certainty, and then turned back to Arthur. A soft, respectful smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face as he reached down in the flashlight beam, picked up his wooden gavel, and struck the desk with a single, final crack that signaled the absolute closure of the dispute. By the unanimous authority of the 1888 Charter, this council hereby appoints Arthur Vance as the permanent regional director and custodian of the Blackwood Ridge Watershed Reserve, Henderson declared, his voice carrying a deep sense of true belonging that made Arthur's throat tighten with an unexpected wave of relief. The emergency abatement order is permanently rescinded, and the demolition permit is canceled. Sheriff Coleman, secure the digital server records from Marcus's holding offices. This town is returning to the physical titles. The victory was absolute. The primary narrative payoff achieved. But as Arthur began to carefully roll the historic parchment grant back into its protective oilcloth sleeve, his technical eye caught a final, microscopic micro-clue printed inside the hollow zinc cylinder of the lead container, a tiny, hand-stamped inscription on the interior base that solved the final lingering question of his family's truth. The letters read, Thomas Vance Logistics, Portland, Archival Division, June 14, 1982. Arthur closed his eyes, a deep, peaceful understanding settling into his mind as he realized that his father, Thomas, hadn't been an unredeemable villain. After using the threat of the Augusta Asylum to blackmail Harlan into silence to save the family business, Thomas had spent the final 40 years of his life in a state of quiet, torturous remorse. He had used his own corporate shipping network to custom manufacture the lead-lined container, secretly vacuum sealing the original 1888 deed and burying it beneath the witness oak himself, deliberately preserving the ultimate weapon of truth so that his son Arthur would eventually find it when his own corporate numbers ran out. It was a silent, posthumous act of paternal restitution that beautifully resolved the final open loop of their lineage, transforming the family's structural ruin into a permanent baseline of honor. The story reached its complete emotional payoff 6 months later, on a brilliant, crisp afternoon in late April. Clear skies had finally broken over Blackwood Ridge, the blinding horizontal sleet of the autumn nor'easter replaced by a soft, warm spring breeze that smelled of damp pine needles, blooming clover, and the clean salt tang of the Atlantic. The stone weather station had been completely transformed. The town council had funded a full restoration of the structure, replacing the rotting plywood patches with clean, triple-paned glass windows that flooded the main instrument room with brilliant sunlight. The exterior fieldstone had been meticulously pointed, and the towering 40-foot iron anemometer mast had been wire-brushed and painted a gleaming forest green, its copper wind cup spinning with a smooth, silent rotation in the afternoon thermal currents. Arthur stood on the stone terrace, dressed in a clean wool shirt, his hands completely healed. The gray cotton gauze replaced by smooth, strong skin that felt comfortable against the brass instruments. He looked out over the vast, pristine landscape of the Oakhaven Valley below, seeing the green canopy of the Whispering Pines watershed stretching safely toward the horizon, its old-growth cedar trees permanently protected from the chainsaws of the southern developers. The real-world conflict had completely dissolved. Marcus Vance had signed a full pretrial diversion agreement, relinquishing all claims to the valley titles to avoid federal forgery charges, and the corporate resort syndicate had completely retreated from the county. Arthur was no longer an outcast or a redundant casualty of automated networks. He was a respected, central anchor of the mountain community, living his life with an absolute, unshakable sense of purpose. Clara walked out onto the porch behind him, carrying a cardboard box filled with new, town-funded hybrid digital manual recording charts. She had taken a permanent leave of absence from her library job in Portland, having formally enrolled in the Regional Environmental Science program at the State University, and she was now serving as her father's official auxiliary land observer during the summer months. She set the box down on the heavy oak desk inside the door, walking over to lean against the stone railing beside him, her face bright and her brown eyes filled with a deep, peaceful contentment that made Arthur's heart swell with a profound sense of complete renewal. "The Schoolhouse Preservation Society just finished clearing the brush from the St. Jude Cemetery plot down in the valley, Dad," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a warm melody that harmonized with the whispering pines below. "Ben Miller and the Historical Board are placing a new granite marker at the gate tomorrow morning. They want you to say a few words as the regional custodian." Arthur smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze his daughter's shoulder, his logistics mind tracing the long, treacherous path that had brought them from the ruins of Portland to the security of this peak. "I'll be there, sweetheart," he said quietly. "We'll bring the manual rain logs from '82, so Ben can see the exact lines Harlan drew to protect those graves." He walked back inside the warm instrument room, the air smelling of clean pine oil, fresh ink, and the subtle warmth of the restored hearth. He walked over to the massive green iron cabinet standing against the bedrock wall, its heavy iron locking bar now polished and sliding smoothly in its brackets without the resistance of the rusted padlock. He opened the top drawer, the steel rollers rumbling with a deep, familiar hum that felt like the steady heartbeat of an old friend. Inside, the hundreds of linen-backed maps were perfectly indexed, each red cotton ribbon tied with a neat, precise knot that reflected his old organizational discipline. Arthur pulled a brand-new, unrolled drafting sheet from the desk, dipping his grandfather's old fountain pen into a fresh well of sepia ink. He reached down and meticulously logged the afternoon's atmospheric metrics: 30.12 inches of mercury, wind west-northwest at 6 knots, skies clear over the ridge. At the bottom of the fresh sheet, in the section reserved for the registrar's validation, Arthur Vance signed his name with a sharp, bold, cursive hand that carried no trace of his old hesitation, adding a final handwritten notation that permanently closed the open loops of his journey. Arthur Vance, custodian of the ridge, October 2026. The lines are clear and the foundations are secure. He rolled the new map into a neat cylinder, tied it with a clean red ribbon, and placed it proudly into the center of the green iron vault, closing the heavy doors as the bright afternoon sun turned the silver shingles of the weather station into a brilliant, unyielding beacon of light on top of the world.